Section 27 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 8, Chapter 1. It was the heart of the London season, nearly 4 years ago, 12 months having almost elapsed since the occurrence of those painful passages at Hellingsley which closed the last book of this history, and long lines of carriages an hour before midnight up to the classic Mount of St. James and along Piccadilly intimated that the world were received at some grand entertainment in Arlington Street. It was the town mansion of the noble family beneath whose roof at Beaumanoir we have more than once introduced the reader, to gain whose courtyard was at this moment the object of emulous coachmen, and to enter whose saloons was to reward the martyr-like patience of their lords and ladies. Among the fortunate who had already succeeded in bowing to their hostess were two gentlemen who, ensconced in a good position, surveyed the scene and made their observations on the passing guests. They were gentlemen who, to judge from their general air and their great consideration with which they were treated by those who were occasionally in their vicinity, were personages whose criticism bore authority. "I say, Jemmy," said the eldest, a dandy who had dined with the Regent, but who was still a dandy, and who enjoyed life almost as much as in the days when Carlton House occupied the terrace which still bears its name. "I say, Jemmy, what a load of young fellows there are! Don't know their names at all. Begin to think fellows are younger than they used to be. Amazing load of young fellows indeed." At this moment an individual who came under the fortunate designation of a young fellow, but whose assured carriage hardly intimated that this was his first season in London, came up to the junior of the two critics and said, "A pretty turn you played us yesterday at White's, Melton. We waited dinner nearly an hour." "My dear fellow, I am infinitely sorry, but I was obliged to go down to Windsor, and I missed the return train. A good dinner? Who had you?" "A capital party, only you were wanted. We had Beaumanoir and Vere and Jack Tufton and Spraggs." "Was Spraggs rich?" "Wasn't he? I have not done laughing yet. He told us a story about the little Biron who was over here last year. I knew her at Paris, and an Indian screen. Killing. Get him to tell it you. The richest thing you ever heard." "Who's your friend?" inquired Mr. Melton's companion, as the young man moved away. "Sir Charles Buckhurst." "Ah, that is Sir Charles Buckhurst. Glad to have seen him. They say he is going it." "He knows what he is about." "Egad, so they all do. A young fellow now of 2 or 3 and 20 knows the world as men used to do after as many years of scrapes. I wonder where there is such a thing as a greenhorn. Effie Crabb says the reason he gives up his house is that he has cleaned out the old generation, and that the new generation would clean him." "Buckhurst is not in that sort of way. He swears by Henry Sidney, a younger son of the Duke, whom you don't know, and young Coningsby, a sort of new set, new ideas and all that sort of thing. Beau tells me a good deal about it, and when I was staying with the Everinghams at Easter they were full of it. Coningsby had just returned from his travels, and they were quite on the qui vive. Lady Everingham is one of their set. I don't know what it is exactly, but I think we shall hear more of it." "A sort of animal magnetism, or unknown tongues, I take it from your description," said his companion. "Well, I don't know what it is," said Mr. Melton, "but it has got hold of all the young fellows who have just come out. Beau is a little bit himself. I had some idea of giving my mind to it, they made such a fuss about it at Everingham, but it requires a devilish deal of history, I believe, and all that sort of thing." "Ah, that's a bore," said his companion. "It is difficult to turn to with a new thing when you are not in the habit of it. I never could manage charades." Mr. Ormsby, passing by, stopped. "They told me you had the gout, Cassilis," he said to Mr. Melton's companion. "So I had, but I have found a fellow who cures the gout instanter. Tom Needham sent him to me, a German fellow, pumice stone pills, sort of a charm, I believe, and all that kind of thing. They say it rubs the gout out of you. I sent him to Luxborough, who was very bad. Cured him directly. Luxborough swears by him. But there's a new thing that Melton has been telling me of, that all the world is going to believe in," said Mr. Cassilis. "Something patronised by Lady Everingham." "A very good patroness," said Mr. Ormsby. "Have you heard anything about it?" continued Mr. Cassilis. "Young Coningsby brought it from abroad. Didn't you say so, Jemmy?" "No, no, my dear fellow. It is not at all that sort of thing." "But they say it requires a deuced deal of history," continued Mr. Cassilis. "One must brush up one's Goldsmith. Canterton used to be the fellow for history at White's. He was always boring one with William the Conqueror, Julius Caesar, and all that sort of thing." "I tell you what," said Mr. Ormsby, looking both sly and solemn, "I should not be surprised if some day or another we have a history about Lady Everingham and young Coningsby." "Pooh!" said Mr. Melton. "He's engaged to be married to her sister, Lady Theresa." "The deuce!" said Mr. Ormsby. "Well, you are a friend of the family, and I suppose you know." "He is a devilish good-looking fellow, that young Coningsby," said Mr. Cassilis. "All the women are in love with him, they say. Lady Eleanor Ducie quite raves about him." "By the by, his grandfather has been very unwell," said Mr. Ormsby, looking mysteriously. "I saw Lady Monmouth here just now," said Mr. Melton. "Oh, he is quite well again," said Mr. Ormsby. "Got an odd story at White's that Lord Monmouth was going to separate from her," said Mr. Cassilis. "No foundation," said Mr. Ormsby, shaking his head. "They are not going to separate, I believe," said Mr. Melton, "but I rather think there was a foundation for the rumour." Mr. Ormsby still shook his head. "Well," continued Mr. Melton, "all I know is that it was looked upon last winter at Paris as a settled thing." "There was some story about some Hungarian," said Mr. Cassilis. "No, that blew over," said Mr. Melton. "It was Trautsmansdorf the row was about." All this time Mr. Ormsby, as the friend of Lord and Lady Monmouth, remained shaking his head; but, as a member of society, and therefore delighting in small scandal, appropriating the gossip with the greatest avidity. "I should think old Monmouth was not the sort of fellow to blow up a woman," said Mr. Cassilis. "Provided she would leave him quietly," said Mr. Melton. "Yes, Lord Monmouth never could live with a woman more than 2 years," said Mr. Ormsby pensively. "And that I thought at the time rather an objection to his marriage." We must now briefly revert to what befell our hero after those unhappy occurrences in the midst of whose first woe we left him. The day after the arrival of Mr. Rigby at the Castle, Coningsby quitted it for London, and before a week had elapsed had embarked for Cadiz. He felt a romantic interest in visiting the land to which Edith owed some blood, and in acquiring the language which he had often admired as she spoke it. A favourable opportunity permitted him in the autumn to visit Athens and the Aegean, which he much desired. In the pensive beauties of that delicate land, where perpetual autumn seems to reign, Coningsby found solace. There is something in the character of Grecian scenery which blends with the humour of the melancholy and the feelings of the sorrowful. Coningsby passed his winter at Rome. The wish of his grandfather had rendered it necessary for him to return to England somewhat abruptly. Lord Monmouth had not visited his native country since his marriage, but the period that had elapsed since that event had considerably improved the prospects of his party. The majority of the Whig cabinet in the House of Commons by 1840 had become little more than nominal, and though it was circulated among their friends, as if from the highest authority, that one was enough, there seemed daily a better chance of their being deprived even of that magical unit. For the first time in the history of this country, since the introduction of the system of parliamentary sovereignty, the government of England depended on the fate of single elections, and indeed by a single vote. It is remarkable to observe the fate of the Whig government was ultimately decided. This critical state of affairs duly reported to Lord Monmouth, revived his political passions, and offered him that excitement which he was ever seeking, and yet for which he had often sighed. The Marquis, too, was weary of Paris. Every day he found it more difficult to be amused. Lucretia had lost her charm. He, from whom nothing could be concealed, perceived that often, while she elaborately attempted to divert him, her mind was wandering elsewhere. Lord Monmouth was quite superior to all petty jealousy and the vulgar feelings of inferior mortals, but his sublime selfishness required devotion. He had calculated that a wife or a mistress who might be in love with another man, however powerfully their interests might prompt them, could not be so agreeable or amusing to their friends and husbands as if they had no such distracting hold upon their hearts or their fancy. Latterly, at Paris, while Lucretia became each day more involved in the vortex of society where all admired and some adored her, Lord Monmouth fell into the easy habit of dining in his private rooms, sometimes tête-à-tête with Vilebecque, whose inexhaustible tales and adventures about a kind of society which Lord Monmouth had always preferred infinitely to the polished and somewhat insipid circles in which he was born, had rendered him the prime favourite of his great patron. Sometimes Vilebecque, too, brought a friend, male or otherwise, whom he thought invested with the rare faculty of distraction. Lord Monmouth cared not who or what they were, provided they were diverting. Vilebecque had written to Coningsby at Rome, by his grandfather's desire, to beg him to return to England and meet Lord Monmouth there. The letter was couched with all the respect and good feeling which Vilebecque really entertained for him whom he addressed. Still, a letter on such a subject, from such a person, was not agreeable to Coningsby, and his reply to it was direct to his grandfather. Lord Monmouth, however, had entirely given over writing letters. Coningsby had met at Paris, on his way to England, Lord and Lady Everingham, and he had returned with them. This revival of an old acquaintance was both agreeable and fortunate for our hero. The vivacity of a clever and charming woman pleasantly disturbed the brooding memory of Coningsby. There is no mortification, however keen, no misery, however desperate, which the spirit of woman cannot in some degree lighten or alleviate. About, too, to make his formal entrance into the great world, he could not have secured a more valuable and accomplished female friend. She gave him every instruction, every intimation that was necessary, cleared the social difficulties which in some degree are experienced on their entrance into the world even by the most highly connected, unless they have this benign assistance, planted him immediately in the position which was expedient, took care that he was invited at once to the right houses, and, with the aid of her husband, that he should become a member of the right clubs. "And who is to have the blue ribbon, Lord Eskdale?" said the Duchess to that nobleman, as he entered and approached to pay his respects. "If I were Melbourne, I would keep it open," replied his lordship. "It is a mistake to give away too quickly." "But suppose they go out?" said her Grace. "Oh, there is always a last day to clear the house. But they will be in another year. The cliff will not be sapped before then. We made a mistake last year about the ladies." "I know you always thought so." "Quarrels about women are always a mistake. One should make it a rule to give up to them, and then they are sure to give up to us." "You have no great faith in our firmness?" "Male firmness is very often obstinacy. Women have always something better, worth all qualities. They have tact." "A compliment to the sex from so finished a critic as Lord Eskdale is appreciated." But at this moment the arrival of some guests terminated the conversation, and Lord Eskdale moved away, and approached a group which Lady Everingham was enlightening. "My dear Lord Fitz Booby," her ladyship observed, "in politics we require faith as well as in all other things." Lord Fitz Booby looked rather perplexed, but possessed of considerable official experience, having held high posts, some in the cabinet, for nearly a quarter of a century, he was too versed to acknowledge that he had not understood a single word that had been addressed to him for the last 10 minutes. He looked on with the same grave, attentive stolidity, occasionally nodding his head, as he was wont of yore when he received a deputation on sugar duties or joint stock banks, and when he made, as was his custom, when particularly perplexed, an occasional note on a sheet of foolscap paper. An opposition in an age of revolution, continued Lady Everingham, must be founded on principles. It cannot depend on mere personal ability and party address taking advantage of circumstances. You have not enunciated a principle for the last 10 years, and when you seemed on the point of acceding to power, it was not on a great question of national interest, but a technical dispute respecting the constitution of an exhausted sugar colony. If you are a Conservative party, we wish to know what you want to conserve, said Lord Vere. If it had not been for the Whig abolition of slavery, said Lord Fitzbooby, goaded into repartee, Jamaica would not have been an exhausted sugar colony. Then what you do want to conserve is slavery, said Lord Vere. No, said Lord Fitzbooby, I am never for retracing our steps. But will you advance? Will you move? And where will you advance, and how will you move? Said Lady Everingham. I think we have had quite enough of advancing, said his lordship. I had no idea your ladyship was a member of the movement party, he added, with a sarcastic grin. But if it were bad, Lord Fitzbooby, to move where we are, as you and your friends have always maintained, how can you reconcile it to principle to remain there? Said Lord Vere. I would make the best of a bad bargain, said Lord Fitzbooby. With a Conservative government, a reformed constitution would be less dangerous. Why, said Lady Everingham, what are your distinctive principles that render the peril less? I appeal to Lord Eskdale, said Lord Fitzbooby. There is Lady Everingham turned quite a radical, I declare. Is not your lordship of opinion that the country must be safer with a Conservative government than with a Liberal? I think the country is always tolerably secure, said Lord Eskdale. Lady Theresa, leaning on the arm of Mr. Lyle, came up at this moment, and unconsciously made a diversion in favour of Lord Fitzbooby. Pray, Theresa, said Lady Everingham, where is Mr. Coningsby? Let us endeavour to ascertain. It so happened that on this day Coningsby and Henry Sidney dined at Grillian's, at the University Club, where, among many friends whom Coningsby had not met for a long time, and among delightful reminiscences, the unconscious hours stole on. It was late when they quitted Grillian's, and Coningsby's brougham was detained for a considerable time before its driver could insinuate himself into the line, which indeed he never would have succeeded in doing, had he not fortunately come across the coachman of the Duke of Agincourt, who, being of the same politics as himself, belonging to the same club, and always blackballing the same men, let him in from a legitimate party feeling. So they arrived in Arlington Street at a very late hour. Coningsby was springing up the staircase, now not so crowded as it had been, and met a retiring party. He was about to say a passing word to a gentleman as he went by, when suddenly Coningsby turned deadly pale. The gentleman could hardly be the cause, for it was the gracious and handsome presence of Lord Beaumanoir. The lady resting on his arm was Edith. They moved on while he was motionless, yet Edith and himself had exchanged glances. His was one of astonishment, but what was the expression of hers? She must have recognized him before he had observed her. She was collected, and she expressed the purpose of her mind in a distant and haughty recognition. Coningsby remained for a moment stupefied, then suddenly turning back, he bounded downstairs and hurried into the cloak-room. He met Lady Wallinger. He spoke rapidly. He held her hand, did not listen to her answers. His eyes wandered about. There were many persons present. At length he recognized Edith enveloped in her mantle. He went forward. He looked at her, as if he would have read her soul. He said something. She changed colour as he addressed her, but seemed instantly by an effort to rally and regain her equanimity, replied to his inquiries with extreme brevity, and Lady Wallinger's carriage being announced, moved away with the same slightly haughty salute as before on the arm of Lord Beaumanoir. Chapter 2. Sadness fell over the once happy family of Millbank after the departure of Coningsby from Hellingsley. When the first pang was over, Edith had found some solace in the sympathy of her aunt, who had always appreciated and admired Coningsby. But it was a sympathy which aspired only to soften sorrow, and not to create hope. But Lady Wallinger, though she lengthened her visit for the sake of her niece, in time quitted them, and then the name of Coningsby was never heard by Edith. Her brother, shortly after the sorrowful and abrupt departure of his friend, had gone to the factories, where he remained, and of which, in future, it was intended that he should assume the principal direction. Mr. Millbank himself, sustained at first by the society of his friend Sir Joseph, to whom he was attached, and occupied with daily reports from his establishment and the transaction of affairs with his numerous and busy constituents, was for a while scarcely conscious of the alteration which had taken place in the demeanour of his daughter. But when they were once more alone together, it was impossible any longer to be blind to the great change. That happy and equable gaiety of spirit, which seemed to spring from an innocent enjoyment of existence, and which had ever distinguished Edith, was wanting. Her sunny glance was gone. She was not indeed always moody and dispirited, but she was fitful, unequal in her tone. That temper whose sweetness had been a domestic proverb had become a little uncertain. Not that her affection for her father was diminished, but there were snatches of unusual irritability which momentarily escaped her, followed by bursts of tenderness that were the creatures of compunction. And often, after some hasty word, she would throw her arms round her father's neck with the fondness of remorse. She pursued her usual avocations, for she had really too well regulated a mind. She was in truth a person of too strong an intellect to neglect any source of occupation and distraction. Her flowers, her pencil, and her books supplied her with these, and music soothed and at times beguiled her agitated thoughts. But there was no joy in the house, and in time Mr. Millbank felt it. Mr. Millbank was vexed, irritated, grieved. Edith, his Edith, the pride and delight of his existence, who had been to him only a source of exultation and felicity, was no longer happy, was perhaps pining away, and there was the appearance, the unjust appearance, that he, her fond father, was the cause and occasion of all this wretchedness. It would appear that the name of Coningsby, to which he now owed a great debt of gratitude, was still doomed to bear him mortification and misery. Truly had the young man said that there was a curse upon their two families. And yet, on reflection, it still seemed to Mr. Millbank that he had acted with as much wisdom and real kindness as decision. How otherwise was he to have acted? The union was impossible. The speedier their separation, therefore, clearly the better. Unfortunate indeed had been his absence from Hellingsley. Unquestionably his presence might have prevented the catastrophe. Oswald should have hindered all this. And yet Mr. Millbank could not shut his eyes to the devotion of his son to Coningsby. He felt he could count on no assistance in this respect from that quarter. Yet how hard upon him that he should seem to figure as a despot or a tyrant to his own children, whom he loved, when he had absolutely acted in an inevitable manner. Edith seemed sad, Oswald sullen. All was changed. All the objects for which this clear-headed, strong-minded, kind-hearted man had been working all his life seemed to be frustrated. And why? Because the young man had made love to his daughter, who was really in no manner entitled to do so. As the autumn drew on, Mr. Millbank found Hellingsley, under existing circumstances, extremely wearisome, and he proposed to his daughter that they should pay a visit to their earlier home. Edith assented without difficulty, but without interest. And yet, as Mr. Millbank immediately perceived, the change was a judicious one, for certainly the spirits of Edith seemed to improve after her return to their valley. There were more objects of interest. Change, too, is always beneficial. If Mr. Millbank had been aware that Oswald had received a letter from Coningsby, written before he quitted Spain, perhaps he might have recognised a more satisfactory reason for the transient liveliness of his daughter which had so greatly gratified him. About a month after Christmas, the meeting of Parliament summoned Mr. Millbank up to London, and he had wished Edith to accompany him. But London in February, to Edith, without friends or connections, her father always occupied and absent from her day and night, seemed to them all, on reflection, to be a life not very conducive to health or cheerfulness, and therefore she remained with her brother. Oswald had heard from Coningsby again from Rome, but at the period he wrote he did not anticipate his return to England. His tone was affectionate but dispirited. Lady Wallinger went up to London after Easter for the season, and Mr. Millbank, now that there was a constant companion for his daughter, took a house and carried Edith back with him to London. Lady Wallinger, who had great wealth and great tact, had obtained by degrees a not inconsiderable position in society. She had a fine house in a fashionable situation, and gave profuse entertainments. The Whigs were under obligations to her husband, and the great Whig ladies were gratified to find in his wife a polished and pleasing person, to whom they could be courteous without any annoyance. So that Edith, under the auspices of her aunt, found herself at once in circles which otherwise she might not easily have entered, but which her beauty, grace, and experience of the most refined society of the Continent qualified her to shine in. One evening they met the Marquis of Beaumanoir, their friend of Rome and Paris, and admirer of Edith, who from that time was seldom from their side. His mother, the Duchess, immediately called both on the Millbanks and the Wallingers, glad not only to please her son, but to express that consideration for Mr. Millbank which the Duke always wished to show. It was, however, of no use. Nothing would induce Mr. Millbank ever to enter what he called aristocratic society. He liked the House of Commons, never paired off, never missed a moment of it, worked at committees all the morning, listened attentively to debates all the night, always dined at Bellamy's when there was a house, and when there was not, liked dining at the Fishmongers' Company, the Russia Company, great emigration banquets, and other joint stock festivities. That was his idea of rational society, business and pleasure combined, a good dinner, and good speeches afterwards. Edith was aware that Coningsby had returned to England, for her brother had heard from him on his arrival, but Oswald had not heard since. A season in London only represented in the mind of Edith the chance, perhaps the certainty, of meeting Coningsby again, of communing together over the catastrophe of last summer, of soothing and solacing each other's unhappiness, and perhaps, with the sanguine imagination of youth, foreseeing a more felicitous future. She had been nearly a fortnight in town, and though moving frequently in the same circles as Coningsby, they had not yet met. It was one of those results which could rarely occur, but even chance enters too frequently into the league against lovers. The invitation to the assembly at House was therefore particularly gratifying to Edith, since she could scarcely doubt that if Coningsby were in town, which her casual inquiries of Lord Beaumanoir induced her to believe was the case, he would be present. Never, therefore, had she repaired to an assembly with such a flattering spirit, and yet there was a fascinating anxiety about it that bewilders the young heart. In vain Edith surveyed the rooms to catch the form of that being whom for a moment she had never ceased to cherish and muse over. He was not there, and at the very moment when, disappointed and mortified, she most required solace, she learned from Mr. Melton that Lady Theresa Sydney, whom she chanced to admire, was going to be married, and to Mr. Coningsby. What a revelation! His silence, perhaps his shunning of her, were no longer inexplicable. What a return for all her romantic devotion in her sad solitude at Hellingsley! Was this to be the end of their twilight rambles, and the sweet pathos of their mutual loves? There seemed to be no truth in man, no joy in life. All the feelings that she had so generously lavished, all returned upon herself. She could have burst into a passion of tears and buried herself in a cloister. Instead of that, civilization made her listen with a serene though tortured countenance. But as soon as it was in her power, pleading a headache to Lady Wallinger, she effected, or thought she had effected, her escape from a scene which harrowed her heart. As for Coningsby, he passed a sleepless night, agitated by the unexpected presence of Edith, and distracted by the manner in which she had received him. To say that her appearance had revived all his passionate affection for her would convey an unjust impression of the nature of his feelings. His affection had never for a moment swerved. It was profound and firm. But unquestionably this sudden vision had brought before him, in startling and more vivid colours, the relations that subsisted between them. There was the being whom he loved and who loved him, and whatever were the barriers which the circumstances of life placed against their union, they were partakers of the solemn sacrament of an unpolluted heart. Coningsby, as we have mentioned, had signified to Oswald his return to England. He had hitherto omitted to write again, not because his spirit faltered, but he was wearied of whispering hope without foundation, and mourning over his chagrined fortunes. Once more in England, once more placed in communication with his grandfather, he felt an increased conviction the difficulties which surrounded him. The society of Lady Everingham and her sister, who had been at the same time her visitor, had been a relaxation, and a beneficial one, to a mind suffering too much from the tension of one idea. But Coningsby had treated the matrimonial project of his gay-minded hostess with the courteous levity in which he believed it had first half originated. He admired and liked Lady Theresa, but there was a reason why he should not marry her, even had his own heart not been absorbed by one of those passions from which men of deep and earnest character never emancipate themselves. After musing and meditating again and again over everything that had occurred, Coningsby fell asleep when the morning had far advanced, resolved to rise when a little refreshed, and find out Lady Wallinger, who, he felt sure, would receive him with kindness. Yet it was fated that this step should not be taken, for while he was at breakfast his servant brought him a letter from Monmouth House, apprising him that his grandfather wished to see him as soon as possible on urgent business. End of chapter 2. Section 28 of Coningsby or the New Generation by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 8, Chapter 3. Lord Monmouth was sitting in the same dressing-room in which he was first introduced to the reader. On the table were several packets of papers that were open and in course of reference, and he dictated his observations to Monsieur Vilbeck, who was writing at his left hand. Thus were they occupied when Coningsby was ushered into the room. "You see, Harry," said Lord Monmouth, "that I am much occupied to-day, yet the business on which I wish to communicate with you is so pressing that it could not be postponed." He made a sign to Vilbeck, and his secretary instantly retired. "I was right in pressing your return to England," continued Lord Monmouth to his grandson, who was a little anxious as to the impending communication, which he could not in any way anticipate. "These are not times when young men should be out of sight. Your public career will commence immediately. The government have resolved on a dissolution. My information is from the highest quarter. You may be astonished, but it is a fact. They are going to dissolve their own House of Commons. Notwithstanding this and the Queen's name, we can beat them. But the race requires the finest jockeying. We can't give a point. Tadpole has been here to me about Darlford. He came specially with a message, I may say an appeal, from one to whom I can refuse nothing. The government count on the seat, though with the new registration 'tis nearly a tie. If we had a good candidate, we could win. But Rigby won't do. He is too much of the old clique, used up, a hack, besides a beaten horse. We are assured the name of Coningsby would be a host. There is a considerable section who support the present fellow who will not vote against a Coningsby. They have thought of you as a fit person, and I have approved of the suggestion. You will, therefore, be the candidate for Darlford with my entire sanction and support, and I have no doubt you will be successful. You may be sure I shall spare nothing, and it will be very gratifying to me, after being robbed of all our boroughs, that the only Coningsby who cares to enter Parliament should nevertheless be able to do so as early as I could fairly desire. Coningsby, the rival of Mr. Millbank on the hustings of Darlford, vanquished to victorious, equally a catastrophe. The fierce passions, the gross insults, the hot blood and the cool lies, the ruffianism and the ribaldry, perhaps the domestic discomfiture and mortification which he was about to be the means of bringing on the roof he loved best in the world, occurred to him with anguish. The countenance of Edith, haughty and mournful last night, rose to him again. He saw her canvassing for her father, and against him. Madness! And for what was he to make this terrible and costly sacrifice? For his ambition? Not even for that divinity or demon for which we all immolate so much. Mighty ambition, forsooth, to succeed to the Rigbys, to enter the House of Commons a slave and a tool, to move according to instructions, and to labour for the low designs of petty spirits, without even the consolation of being a dupe. What sympathy could there exist between Coningsby and the great Conservative party, that for 10 years, in an age of revolution, had never promulgated a principle, whose only intelligible and consistent policy seemed to be an attempt, very grateful of course to the feelings of an English royalist, to revive Irish Puritanism? Who, when in power in 1835, had used that power only to evince their utter ignorance of church principles, and who were at this moment, when Coningsby was formally solicited to join their ranks, in open insurrection against the prerogatives of the English monarchy. "Do you anticipate then an immediate dissolution, sir?" inquired Coningsby after a moment's pause. "We must anticipate it, though I think it is doubtful. It may be next month, it may be in the autumn. They may tide over another year, as Lord Eskdale thinks, and his opinion always weighs with me. He is very safe. Tadpole believes they will dissolve at once. But whether they dissolve now, or in a month's time, or in the autumn, or next year, our course is clear. We must declare our intentions immediately. We must hoist our flag. Monday next there is a great Conservative dinner at Darlford. You must attend it. That will be the finest opportunity in the world for you to announce yourself." "Don't you think, sir," said Coningsby, "that such an announcement would be rather premature? It is, in fact, embarking in a contest which may last a year, perhaps more." "What you say is very true," said Lord Monmouth. "No doubt it is very troublesome, very disgusting. Any canvassing is. But we must take things as we find them. You cannot get into Parliament now in the good old gentlemanlike way, and we ought to be thankful that this interest has been fostered for our purpose." Coningsby looked on the carpet, cleared his throat as if about to speak, and then gave something like a sigh. "I think you had better be off the day after to morrow," said Lord Monmouth. "I have sent instructions to the steward to do all he can in so short a time, for I wish you to entertain the principal people." "You are most kind. You are always most kind to me, dear sir," said Coningsby in a hesitating tone, and with an air of great embarrassment. "But in truth I have no wish to enter Parliament." "What?" said Lord Monmouth. "I feel that I am not sufficiently prepared for so great a responsibility as a seat in the House of Commons," said Coningsby. "Responsibility!" said Lord Monmouth, smiling. "What responsibility is there? How can any one have a more agreeable seat? The only person to whom you are responsible is your own relation who brings you in. And I don't suppose there can be any difference on any point between us. You are certainly still young, but I was younger by nearly 2 years when I first went in, and I found no difficulty. There can be no difficulty. All you have to do is to vote with your party. As for speaking, if you have a talent that way, take my advice, don't be in a hurry. Learn to know the House, learn the House to know you. If a man be discreet, he cannot enter Parliament too soon." "It is not exactly that, sir," said Coningsby. "Then what is it, my dear Harry? You see to-day I have much to do, yet as your business is pressing, I would not postpone seeing you an hour. I thought you would have been very much gratified." "You mentioned that I had nothing to do but to vote with my party, sir," replied Coningsby. "You mean, of course, by that term what is understood by the Conservative party." "Of course, our friends." "I am sorry," said Coningsby, rather pale, but speaking with firmness. "I am sorry that I could not support the Conservative party." "By !" exclaimed Lord Monmouth, starting in his seat. "Some woman has got hold of him and made him a Whig." "No, my dear grandfather," said Coningsby, scarcely able to repress a smile, serious as the interview was becoming. "Nothing of the kind, I assure you. No person can be more anti-Whig." "I don't know what you are driving at, sir," said Lord Monmouth, in a hard, dry tone. "I wish to be frank, sir," said Coningsby, "and I am very sensible of your goodness in permitting me to speak to you on the subject. What I mean to say is, that I have for a long time looked upon the Conservative party as a body who have betrayed their trust, more from ignorance, I admit, than from design, yet clearly a body of individuals totally unequal to the exigencies of the epoch, and indeed unconscious of its real character." "You mean giving up those Irish corporations?" said Lord Monmouth. "Well, between ourselves, I am quite of the same opinion. But we must mount higher. We must go to 28 for the real mischief. But what is the use of lamenting the past? Peel is the only man, suited to the times and all that. At least we must say so, and try to believe so. We can't go back. And it is our own fault that we have let the chief power out of the hands of our own order. It was never thought of in the time of your great-grandfather, sir. And if a commoner were for a season permitted to be the nominal premier to do the detail, there was always a secret committee of great 1688 nobles to give him his instructions." "I should be very sorry to see secret committees of great 1688 nobles again," said Coningsby. "Then what the devil do you want to see?" said Lord Monmouth. "Political faith," said Coningsby, "instead of political infidelity." Said Lord Monmouth. "Before I support Conservative principles," continued Coningsby, "I merely wish to be informed what those principles aim to conserve. It could not appear to be the prerogative of the Crown, since the principal portion of a Conservative oration now is an invective against a late royal act, which they describe as a bedchamber plot. Is it the Church which they wish to conserve? What is a threatened appropriation clause against an actual Church commission in the hands of parliamentary laymen? Could the Long Parliament have done worse? Well then, if it is neither the Crown nor the Church whose rights and privileges this Conservative party propose to vindicate, is it your House, the House of Lords, whose powers they are prepared to uphold? Is it not notorious that the very man whom you have elected as your leader in that House declares among his Conservative adherents that henceforth the assembly that used to furnish those very committees of great Revolution nobles that you mention is to initiate nothing, and without a struggle is to subside into that undisturbed repose which resembles the imperial tranquillity that secured the frontiers by paying tribute? "All this is vastly fine," said Lord Monmouth, "but I see no means by which I can attain my object but by supporting Peel. After all, what is the end of all parties and all politics? To gain your object. I want to turn our coronet into a ducal one, and to get your grandmother's barony called out of abeyance in your favour. It is impossible that Peel can refuse me. I have already purchased an ample estate with a view of entailing it on you and your issue. You will make a considerable alliance. You may marry, if you please, Lady Theresa Sidney. I hear the report with pleasure. Count on my at once entering into any arrangement conducive to your happiness. My dear grandfather, you have ever been to me only too kind and generous. To whom should I be kind but to you, my own blood, that has never crossed me, and of whom I have reason to be proud? Yes, Harry, it gratifies me to hear you admired, and to learn your success. All I want now is to see you in Parliament. A man should be in Parliament early. There is a sort of stiffness about every man, no matter what may be his talents, who enters Parliament late in life. And now, fortunately, the occasion offers. You will go down on Friday, feed the notabilities well, speak out, praise Peel, abuse O'Connell and the ladies of the bedchamber, anathematise all waverers, say a good deal about Ireland, stick to the Irish Registration Bill, that's a good card. And above all, my dear Harry, don't spare that fellow Millbank. Remember, in turning him out, you not only gain a vote for the Conservative cause at our coronet, but you crush my foe. Spare nothing for that object. I count on you, boy. I should grieve to be backward in anything that concerned your interest or your honour, sir, said Coningsby, with an air of great embarrassment. I am sure you would, I am sure you would, said Lord Monmouth, in a tone of some kindness. And I feel at this moment, continued Coningsby, that there is no personal sacrifice which I am not prepared to make for them, except one. My interests, my affections, they should not be placed in the balance, if yours, sir, were at stake, though there are circumstances which might involve me in a position of as much mental distress as a man could well endure. But I claim for my convictions, my dear grandfather, a generous tolerance. I can't follow you, sir, said Lord Monmouth, again in his hard tone. Our interests are inseparable, and therefore there can never be any sacrifice of conduct on your part. What you mean by sacrifice of affections, I don't comprehend. But as for your opinions, you have no business to have any other than those I uphold. You are too young to form opinions. I am sure I wish to express them with no unbecoming confidence, replied Coningsby. I have never intruded them on your ear before. But this being an occasion when you yourself said, sir, I was about to commence my public career, I confess I thought it was my duty to be frank. I would not entail on myself long years of mortification by one of those ill-considered entrances into political life which so many public men have cause to deplore. You go with your family, sir, like a gentleman. You are not to consider your opinions like a philosopher or a political adventurer. Yes, sir, said Coningsby, with animation, but men going with their families like gentlemen, and losing sight of every principle on which the society of this country ought to be established, produced the Reform Bill. Damn the Reform Bill, said Lord Monmouth. If the Duke had not quarrelled with Lord Grey on a coal committee, we should never have had the Reform Bill, and Grey would have gone to Ireland. You are in as great peril now as you were in 1830, said Coningsby. No, 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 said Lord Monmouth. The Tory party is organised now. They will not catch us napping again. These Conservative associations have done the business. But what are they organised for? Said Coningsby. At the best, to turn out the Whigs. And when you have turned out the Whigs, what then? You may get your ducal coronet, sir. But a duke now is not so great a man as a baron was but a century back. We cannot struggle against the irresistible stream of circumstances. Power has left our order. This is not an age for factitious aristocracy. As for my grandmother's barony, I should look upon the termination of its abeyance in my favour as the act of my political extinction. What we want, sir, is not to fashion new dukes and furbish up old baronies, but to establish great principles which may maintain the realm and secure the happiness of the people. Let me see authority once more honoured, a solemn reverence again the habit of our lives. Let me see property acknowledging, as in the old days of faith, that labour is his twin brother, and that the essence of all tenure is the performance of duty. Let results such as these be brought about, and let me participate, however feebly, in the great fulfilment, and public life then indeed becomes a noble career, and a seat in Parliament an enviable distinction. "I tell you what it is, Harry," said Lord Monmouth, very dryly. "Members of this family may think as they like, but they must act as I please. You must go down to Friday to Darlford and declare yourself a candidate for the town, or I shall reconsider our mutual positions. I would say you must go to morrow, but it is only courteous to Rigby to give him a previous intimation of your movement, and that cannot be done to day. I sent for Rigby this morning on other business which now occupies me, and find he is out of town. He will return to morrow, and will be here at 3 o'clock, when you can meet him. You will meet him, I doubt not, like a man of sense," added Lord Monmouth, looking at Coningsby with a glance such as he had never before encountered, "who is not prepared to sacrifice all the objects of life for the pursuit of some fantastical puerilities." His lordship rang a bell on his table for Villebecque, and to prevent any further conversation, resumed his papers. Chapter 4. It would have been difficult for any person unconscious of crime to have felt more dejected than Coningsby when he rode out of the courtyard of Monmouth House. The love of Edith would have consoled him for the destruction of his prosperity. The proud fulfilment of his ambition might in time have proved some compensation for his crushed affections, but his present position seemed to offer no single source of solace. There came over him that irresistible conviction that is at times the dark room of all of us, that the bright period of our life is past, that a future awaits us only of anxiety, failure, mortification, despair, that none of our resplendent visions can ever be realised, and that we add but one more victim to the long and dreary catalogue of baffled aspirations. Nor could he indeed by any combination see the means to extricate himself from the perils that were encompassing him. There was something about his grandfather that defied persuasion. Prone as eloquent youth generally is to believe in the resistless power of its appeals, Coningsby despaired at once of ever moving Lord Monmouth. There had been a callous dryness in his manner, an unswerving purpose in his spirit, that at once baffled all attempts at influence. Nor could Coningsby forget the look he received when he quitted the room. There was no possibility of mistaking it. It said at once, without periphrasis, "Cross my purpose, and I will crush you." This was the moment when the sympathy, if not the counsels, of friendship might have been grateful. A clever woman might have afforded even more than sympathy. Some happy device that might have even released him from the mesh in which he was involved. And once Coningsby had turned his horse's head to Park Lane to call on Lady Everingham. But surely, if there were a sacred secret in the world, it was the one which subsisted between himself and Edith. No, that must never be violated. Then there was Lady Wallinger. He could at least speak with freedom to her. He resolved to tell her all. He looked in for a moment at a club to take up the Court Guide and find her direction. A few men were standing in a bow window. He heard Mr. Cassilis say, "So Beau, they say, is booked at last. The new beauty, have you heard?" "I saw him very sweet on her last night," rejoined his companion. "Has she any tin?" "Deuced deal, they say," replied Mr. Cassilis. "The father is a cotton lord, and they all have loads of tin, you know. Nothing like them now." "He is in Parliament, is not he?" "Gad, I believe he is," said Mr. Cassilis. "I never know who is in Parliament these days. I remember when there were only 10 men in the House of Commons who were not either members of Brooks or this place. Everything is so deuced changed." "I hear 'tis an old affair of Beau," said another gentleman. "It was all done a year ago at Rome or Paris." "They say she refused him then," said Mr. Cassilis. "Well, that is tolerably cool for a manufacturer's daughter," said his friend. "What next?" "I wonder how the Duke likes it," said Mr. Cassilis. "Or the Duchess," added one of his friends. "Or the Everinghams," added the other. "The Duke will be deuced glad to see Beau settled, I take it," said Mr. Cassilis. "A good deal depends on the tin," said his friend. Coningsby threw down the Court Guide with a sinking heart. In spite of every insuperable difficulty, hitherto the end and object of all his aspirations and all his exploits, sometimes even almost unconsciously to himself, was Edith. It was over. The strange manner of last night was fatally explained. The heart that had once been his was now another's. To the man who still loves there is that conviction the most profound and desolate sorrow of which our nature is capable. All the recollection of the past, all the once cherished prospects of the future, blend into one bewildering anguish. Coningsby quitted the club, and mounting his horse, rode rapidly out of town, almost unconscious of his direction. He found himself at length in a green lane near Williston, silent and undisturbed. He pulled up his horse, and summoned all his mind to the contemplation of his prospects. Edith was lost. Now, should he return to his grandfather, accept his mission, and go down to Darlford on Friday? Favour and fortune, power, prosperity, rank, distinction, would be the consequence of this step. Might not he add even vengeance? Was there to be no term to his endurance? Might not he teach this proud, prejudiced manufacturer, with all his virulence and despotic caprices, a memorable lesson? And his daughter, too, this betrothed, after all, of a young noble, with her flush futurity of splendour and enjoyment, was she to hear of him only, if indeed she heard of him at all, as of one toiling or trifling in the humbler positions of existence, and wonder with a blush that he could ever have been the hero of her romantic girlhood? What degradation in the idea! His cheek burned at the possibility of such ignominy. It was a conjuncture in his life that required decision. He thought of his companions, who looked up to him with such ardent anticipations of his fame, of delight in his career, and confidence in his leading. Were all these high and fond fancies to be balked? On the very threshold of life was he to blunder? 'Tis the first step that leads to all, and his was to be a wilful error. He remembered his first visit to his grandfather, and the delight of his friends at Eton at his report on his return. After 8 years of initiation, was he to lose the favour then so highly prized, when the results which they had so long counted on were on the very eve of accomplishment? Parliament and riches, and rank and power, these were facts, realities, substances that none could mistake. Was he to sacrifice them for speculations, theories, shadows, perhaps the vapours of a green and conceited brain? No, by heaven, no! He was like Caesar by the starry river's side, watching the image of the planets on his fatal waters. The die was cast. The sun set, the twilight spell fell upon his soul, the exaltation of his spirit died away. Beautiful thoughts, full of sweetness and tranquillity and consolation, came clustering round his heart like seraphs. He thought of Edith in her hours of fondness. He thought of the pure and solemn moments when to mingle his name with the heroes of humanity was his aspiration, and to achieve immortal fame the inspiring purpose of his life. What were the tawdry accidents of vulgar ambition to him? No domestic despot could deprive him of his intellect, his knowledge, the sustaining power of an unpolluted conscience. If he possessed the intelligence in which he had confidence, the world would recognise his voice, even if not placed upon a pedestal. If the principles of his philosophy were true, the great heart of the nation would respond to their expression. Coningsby felt at this moment a profound conviction which never again deserted him, that the conduct which would violate the affections of his heart or the dictates of the conscience, however it may lead to immediate success, is a fatal error. Conscious that he was perhaps verging on some painful vicissitude of his life, he devoted himself to a love that seemed hopeless, and to a fame that was perhaps a dream. It was under the influence of these solemn resolutions that he wrote, on his return home, a letter to Lord Monmouth, in which he expressed all that affection which he really felt for his grandfather, and all the pangs which it cost him to adhere to the conclusions he had already announced. In terms of tenderness and even humility, he declined to become a candidate for Darlford, or even to enter Parliament, except as the master of his own conduct. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. Lady Monmouth was reclining on a sofa in that beautiful boudoir which had been fitted up under the superintendence of Mr. Rigby, but, as he then believed, for the Princess Colonna. The walls were hung with amber satin, painted by Delaroche, with such subjects as might be expected from his brilliant and picturesque pencil. Fair forms, heroes and heroines in dazzling costume, the offspring of chivalry merging into what is commonly styled civilization, moved in graceful or fantastic groups amid palaces and gardens. The ceiling, carved in the deep honeycomb fashion of the Saracens, was richly gilt and picked out in violet. Upon a violet carpet of velvet was represented the marriage of Cupid and Psyche. It was about 2 hours after Coningsby had quitted Monmouth House, and Flora came in, sent for by Lady Monmouth, as was her custom, to read to her as she was employed with some light work. "'Tis a new book of Sioux," said Lucretia. "They say it is good." Flora, seated by her side, began to read. Reading was an accomplishment which distinguished Flora. But to-day her voice faltered, her expression was uncertain. She seemed but imperfectly to comprehend her page. More than once Lady Monmouth looked round at her with an inquisitive glance. Suddenly Flora stopped and burst into tears. "Oh, madam," she at last exclaimed, "if you would but speak to Mr. Coningsby, all might be right." "What is this?" said Lady Monmouth, turning quickly on the sofa. Then, collecting herself in an instant, she continued with less abruptness and more suavity than usual. "Tell me, Flora, what is it? What is the matter?" "My lord," sobbed Flora, "has quarrelled with Mr. Coningsby." An expression of eager interest came over the countenance of Lucretia. "Why have they quarrelled?" "I do not know they have quarrelled. It is not perhaps a right term, but my lord is very angry with Mr. Coningsby." "Not very angry, I should think, Flora. And about what?" "Oh, very angry, madam," said Flora, shaking her head mournfully. "My lord told Monsieur Villebecque that perhaps Mr. Coningsby would never enter the house again." "Was it to-day?" asked Lucretia. "This morning. Mr. Coningsby has only left this hour or two. He will not do what my lord wishes about some seat in the chamber. I do not know exactly what it is, but my lord is in one of his moods of terror. My father is frightened even to go into his room when he is so." "Has Mr. Rigby been here to-day?" asked Lucretia. "Mr. Rigby is not in town. My father went for Mr. Rigby this morning before Mr. Coningsby came, and he found that Mr. Rigby was not in town. That is why I know it." Lady Monmouth rose from her sofa and walked once or twice up and down the room. Then, turning to Flora, she said, "Go away now. The book is stupid. It does not amuse me. Stop. Find out all you can for me about the quarrel before I speak to Mr. Coningsby." Flora quitted the room. Lucretia remained for some time in meditation. Then she wrote a few lines, which she dispatched at once to Mr. Rigby. End of chapter 5. Section 29 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 8, Chapter 6. What a great man was the Right Honourable Nicholas Rigby! Here was one of the first peers of England, and one of the finest ladies in London, both waiting with equal anxiety his return to town, and unable to transact two affairs of vast importance, yet wholly unconnected, without his interposition. What was the secret of the influence of this man, confided in by everybody, trusted by none? His counsels were not deep, his expedients were not felicitous. He had no feeling, and he could create no sympathy. It is that, in most of the transactions of life, there is some portion which no one cares to accomplish, and which everybody wishes to be achieved. This was always the portion of Mr. Rigby. In the eye of the world he had constantly the appearance of being mixed up with high dealings, and negotiations, and arrangements of fine management, whereas in truth, notwithstanding his splendid livery and the airs he gave himself in the servants' hall, his real business in life had ever been to do the dirty work. Mr. Rigby had been shut up much at his villa of late. He was concocting, you could not term it composing, an article, a very slashing article, which was to prove that the penny postage must be the destruction of the aristocracy. It was a grand subject, treated in his highest style. His parallel portraits of Rowland Hill, the conqueror of Almares, and Rowland Hill, the deviser of the cheap postage, were enormously fine. It was full of passages in italics, little words in great capitals, and almost drew tears. The statistical details also were highly interesting and novel. Several of the old postmen, both Twopenny and General, who had been in office with himself, and who were inspired with an equal zeal against that spirit of reform of which they had alike been victims, supplied him with information which nothing but a breach of ministerial duty could have furnished. The prophetic peroration as to the irresistible progress of democracy was almost as powerful as one of Rigby's speeches on Aldborough or Amersham. There never was a fellow for giving a good hearty kick to the people like Rigby. Himself sprung from the dregs of the populace, this was disinterested. What could be more patriotic and magnanimous than his jeremiads over the fall of the Montmorency and the Crillon, or the possible catastrophe of the Percys and the Manners? The truth of all this hullabaloo was that Rigby had a sly pension, which by an inevitable association of ideas he always connected with the maintenance of an aristocracy. All his rigmarole dissertations on the French Revolution were impelled by this secret influence, and when he wailed over La Guerre au Château, and moaned like a mandrake over Nottingham Castle in flames, the rogue had an eye all the while to quarter day. Arriving in town the day after Coningsby's interview with his grandfather, Mr. Rigby found a summons to Monmouth House waiting him, and an urgent note from Lucretia begging that he would permit nothing to prevent him from seeing her for a few minutes before he called on the Marquess. Lucretia, acting on the unconscious intimation of Flora, had, in the course of 24 hours, obtained pretty ample and accurate details of the cause of contention between Coningsby and her husband. She could inform Mr. Rigby not only that Lord Monmouth was highly incensed against his grandson, but that the cause of their misunderstanding arose about a seat in the House of Commons, and that seat, too, the one which Mr. Rigby had long appropriated to himself, and over whose registration he had watched with such affectionate solicitude. Lady Monmouth arranged this information like a first-rate artist, and gave it a grouping and a colour which produced the liveliest effect upon her confederate. The countenance of Rigby was almost ghastly as he received the intelligence. A grin, half of malice, half of terror, played over his features. "I told you to beware of him long ago," said Lady Monmouth. He has ever been, in the way of both of us." "He is in my power," said Rigby. "We can crush him." "How?" "He is in love with the daughter of Millbank, the man who bought Hellingsley." "Ha!" exclaimed Lady Monmouth in a prolonged tone. "He was at Coningsby all last summer, hanging about her. I found the younger Millbank quite domiciliated at the Castle, a fact which, of itself, if known to Lord Monmouth, would ensure the lad's annihilation. "And you kept this fine news for a winter campaign, my good Mr. Rigby," said Lady Monmouth with a subtle smile. "It was a weapon of service. I give you my compliments." "The time is not always ripe," said Mr. Rigby. "But it is now most mature. Let us not conceal it from ourselves that since his first visit to Coningsby we have neither of us really been in the same position which we then occupied or believed we should occupy. My lord, though you would scarcely believe it, has a weakness for this boy, and though I by my marriage and you by your zealous ability have apparently secured a permanent hold upon his habits, I have never doubted when the crisis comes we shall find that the golden fruit is plucked by one who has not watched over the garden. You take me? There is no reason why we two should clash together. We can both of us find what we want, and more securely, if we work in company. I trust my devotion to you has never been doubted, dear madam. Nor to yourself, dear Mr. Rigby. Go now, the game is before you. Rid me of this Coningsby, and I will secure you all that you want. Doubt not me, there is no reason. I want a firm ally. There must be two. It shall be done, said Rigby. It must be done. If once the notion gets wind that one of the Castle family may perchance stand for Darlford, all the present combinations will be disorganised. It must be done at once. I know that the government will dissolve. So I hear for certain, said Lucretia. Be sure there is no time to lose. What does he want with you to-day? I know not, there are so many things. To be sure, and yet I cannot doubt he will speak of this quarrel. Let not the occasion be lost. Whatever his mood, the subject may be introduced. If good, you will guide him more easily. If dark, the love for the Hellingsley girl, the fact of the brother being in his castle, drinking his wine, riding his horses, ordering about his servants, you will omit no details. A Millbank quite at home at Coningsby will lash him to madness. 'Tis quite ripe. Not a word that you have seen me. Go, go, or he may hear that you have arrived. I shall be home all morning. It will be but gallant that you should pay me a little visit when you have transacted your business. You understand? Au revoir. Lady Monmouth took up again her French novel, but her eyes soon glanced over the page, unattached by its contents. Her own existence was too interesting to find any excitement in fiction. It was nearly 3 years since her marriage. That great step which she had ever had a conviction was to lead to results still greater. Of late she had often been filled with a presentiment that they were near at hand. Never more so than on this day. Irresistible was the current of associations that led her to meditate on freedom, wealth, power, on a career which should at the same time dazzle the imagination and gratify her heart. Notwithstanding the gossip of Paris, founded on no authentic knowledge of her husband's character or information, based on the haphazard observations of the floating multitude, Lucretia herself had no reason to fear that her influence over Lord Monmouth, if exerted, was materially diminished. But satisfied that he had formed no other tie, with her ever the test of her position, she had not thought it expedient, and certainly would have found it irksome, to maintain that influence by any ostentatious means. She knew that Lord Monmouth was capricious, easily wearied, soon palled, and that on men who have no affections, affection has no hold. Their passions or their fancies, on the contrary, as it seemed to her, are rather stimulated by neglect or indifference, provided that they are not systematic, and the circumstance of a wife being admired by one who is not her husband sometimes wonderfully revives the passion or renovates the respect of him who should be devoted to her. The health of Lord Monmouth was the subject which never was long absent from the vigilance or the meditation of Lucretia. She was well assured that his life was no longer secure. She knew that after their marriage he had made a will, which secured to her a large portion of his great wealth in case of their having no issue, and after the accident at Paris, all hope in that respect was over. Recently the extreme anxiety which Lord Monmouth had evinced about terminating the abeyance of the barony to which his first wife was a co-heiress in favour of his grandson, had alarmed Lucretia. To establish in the land another branch of the house of Coningsby was evidently the last excitement of Lord Monmouth, and perhaps a permanent one. If the idea were once accepted, notwithstanding the limit to its endowment which Lord Monmouth might at the first start contemplate, Lucretia had sufficiently studied his temperament to be convinced that all his energies and all his resources would ultimately be devoted to its practical fulfilment. Her original prejudice against Coningsby and jealousy of his influence had therefore of late been considerably aggravated, and the intelligence that for the first time there was a misunderstanding between Coningsby and her husband filled her with excitement and hope. She knew her lord well enough to feel assured that the cause for displeasure in the present instance could not be a light one. She resolved instantly to labour that it should not be transient, and it so happened that she had applied for aid in this endeavour to the very individual in whose power it rested to accomplish all her desire, while in doing so he felt at the same time he was defending his own position and advancing his own interests. Lady Monmouth was now waiting with some excitement the return of Mr. Rigby. His interview with his patron was of unusual length. An hour, and more than an hour, had elapsed. Lady Monmouth again threw aside the book which more than once she had discarded. She paced the room, restless rather than disquieted. She had complete confidence in Rigby's ability for the occasion, and with her knowledge of Lord Monmouth's character, she could not contemplate the possibility of failure if the circumstances were adroitly introduced to his consideration. Still time stole on. The harassing and exhausting process of suspense was acting on her nervous system. She began to think that Rigby had not found the occasion favourable for the catastrophe, that Lord Monmouth, from apprehension of disturbing Rigby and entailing explanations on himself, had avoided the necessary communication, that her skilful combination for the moment had missed. 2 hours had now elapsed, and Lucretia, in a state of considerable irritation, was about to inquire whether Mr. Rigby were there with his lordship, when the door of her boudoir opened, and that gentleman appeared. 'How long you have been!' exclaimed Lady Monmouth. 'Now sit down, and tell me what has passed.' Lady Monmouth pointed to the seat which Flora had occupied. 'I thank your ladyship,' said Mr. Rigby, with a somewhat grave and yet perplexed expression of countenance, and seating himself at some little distance from his companion, 'but I am very well here.' There was a pause. Instead of responding to the invitation of Lady Monmouth to communicate with his usual readiness and volubility, Mr. Rigby was silent, and, if it were possible to use such an expression with regard to such a gentleman, apparently embarrassed. 'Well,' said Lady Monmouth, 'does he know about the Millbanks?' 'Everything,' said Mr. Rigby. 'And what did he say?' 'His lordship was greatly shocked,' replied Mr. Rigby, with a pious expression of features. 'Such monstrous ingratitude! As his lordship very justly observed, it is impossible to say what is going on under my own roof, or to what I can trust.' 'But he made an exception in your favour, I dare say, my dear Mr. Rigby,' said Lady Monmouth. 'Lord Monmouth was pleased to say that I possessed his entire confidence,' said Mr. Rigby, 'and that he looked to me in his difficulties.' 'Very sensible of him. And what is to become of Mr. Coningsby?' 'The steps which his lordship is about to take with reference to the establishment generally,' said Mr. Rigby, 'will allow the connection that at present subsists between that gentleman and his noble relative, now that Lord Monmouth's eyes are open to his real character, to terminate naturally, without the necessity of any formal explanation.' 'But what do you mean by the steps he is going to take in his establishment generally?' 'Lord Monmouth thinks he requires change of scene. "Oh, is he going to drag me abroad again?" exclaimed Lady Monmouth with great impatience. "Why, not exactly," said Mr. Rigby, rather demurely. "I hope he is not going again to that dreadful castle in Lancashire." "Lord Monmouth was thinking that, as you were tired of Paris, you might find some of the German baths agreeable." "Why, there is nothing that Lord Monmouth dislikes so much as a German bathing place." "Exactly," said Mr. Rigby. "Then how capricious in him wanting to go to them." "He does not want to go to them." "What do you mean, Mr. Rigby?" said Lady Monmouth in a lower voice, and looking him full in the face with a glance seldom bestowed. There was a churlish and unusual look about Rigby. It was as if malignant, and yet at the same time a little frightened. He had screwed himself into doggedness. "I mean what Lord Monmouth means. He suggests that if your ladyship were to pass the summer at Kissingen, for example, and a paragraph in the Morning Post were to announce that his lordship was about to join you there, all awkwardness would be removed, and no one could for a moment take the liberty of supposing, even if his lordship did not ultimately reach you, that anything like a separation had occurred." "A separation?" said Lady Monmouth. "Quite amicable," said Mr. Rigby. "I would never have consented to interfere in the affair, but to secure that most desirable point." "I will see Lord Monmouth at once," said Lucretia, rising, her natural pallor aggravated into a ghoul-like tint. "His lordship has gone out," said Mr. Rigby, rather stubbornly. "Our conversation, sir, then finishes. I await his return." She bowed haughtily. "His lordship will never return to Monmouth House again." Lucretia sprang from the sofa. "Miserable craven!" she exclaimed. "Has the cowardly tyrant fled? And he really thinks that I am to be crushed by such an instrument as this? Pah! He may leave Monmouth House, but I shall not. Begone, sir." "Still anxious to secure an amicable separation," said Mr. Rigby, "your ladyship must allow me to place the circumstances of the case fairly before your excellent judgment. Lord Monmouth has decided upon a course. You know as well as I that he never swerves from his resolutions. He has left peremptory instructions, and he will listen to no appeal. He has empowered me to represent to your ladyship that he wishes in every way to consider your convenience. He suggests that everything, in short, should be arranged as if his lordship were himself unhappily no more. That your ladyship should at once enter into your jointure, which shall be made payable quarterly to your order, provided you can find it convenient to live upon the Continent," added Mr. Rigby with some hesitation. "And suppose I cannot?" "Why, then we will leave your ladyship to the assertion of your rights." "We?" "I beg your ladyship's pardon. I speak as the friend of the family, the trustee of your marriage settlement, well known also as Lord Monmouth's executor," said Mr. Rigby, his countenance gradually regaining its usual callous confidence, and some degree of self-complacency, as he remembered the good things which he enumerated. "I have decided," said Lady Monmouth. "I will assert my rights. Your master has mistaken my character and his own position. He shall rue the day that he assailed me." "I should be sorry if there were any violence," said Mr. Rigby, "especially as everything is left to my management and control. An office, indeed, which I only accepted for your mutual advantage. I think, upon reflection, I might put before your ladyship some considerations which might induce you, on the whole, to be of the opinion that it will be better for us to draw together in this business, as we have hitherto, indeed, throughout an acquaintance of now some years." Rigby was assuming all his usual tone of brazen familiarity. "Your self-confidence exceeds even Lady Monmouth's estimate of it," said Lucretia. Now, you are unkind. Your ladyship mistakes my position. I am interfering in this business for your sake. I might have refused the office. It would have fallen to another, who would have fulfilled it without any delicacy and consideration for your feelings. View my interposition in that light, my dear Lady Monmouth, and circumstances will assume altogether a new colour." I beg that you will quit the house, sir." Mr. Rigby shook his head. "I would with pleasure to oblige you, were it in my power, but Lord Monmouth has particularly desired that I should take up my residence here permanently. The servants are now my servants. It is useless to ring the bell. For your ladyship's sake, I wish everything to be accomplished with tranquillity, and, if possible, friendliness and good feeling. You can have even a week for the preparations for your departure, if necessary. I will take that upon myself. Any carriages, too, that you desire, your jewels, at least all those that are not at the banker's. The arrangement about your jointure, your letters of credit, even your passport, I will attend to myself, only too happy if by this painful interference I have in any way contributed to soften the annoyance which at the first blush you may naturally experience, but which, like everything else, take my word, will wear off." "I shall send for Lord Eskdale," said Lady Monmouth. "He is a gentleman." "I am quite sure," said Mr. Rigby, "that Lord Eskdale will give you the same advice as myself, if he only reads your ladyship's letters," he added slowly, "to Prince Trautsmansdorff." "My letters?" said Lady Monmouth. "Pardon me," said Rigby, putting his hand in his pocket, as if to guard some treasure. "I have no wish to revive painful associations, but I have them, and I must act upon them if you persist in treating me as a foe, who am in reality your best friend, which indeed I ought to be, having the honour of acting as trustee under your marriage settlement, and having known you so many years." "Leave me for the present alone," said Lady Monmouth. "Send me my servant, if I have one. I shall not remain here the week which you mention, but quit at once this house, which I wish I had never entered. Adieu, Mr. Rigby. You are now Lord of Monmouth House, and yet I cannot help feeling you too will be discharged before he dies." Mr. Rigby made Lady Monmouth a bow such as became the master of the house, and then withdrew. Chapter VII. A paragraph in the Morning Post, a few days after his interview with his grandfather, announcing that Lord and Lady Monmouth had quitted town for the baths of Kissingen, startled Coningsby, who called the same day at Monmouth House in consequence. There he learned more authentic details of their unexpected movements. It appeared that Lady Monmouth had certainly departed, and the porter, with a rather sceptical visage, informed Coningsby that Lord Monmouth was to follow, but when he could not tell. At present his lordship was at Brighton, and in a few days was about to take possession of a villa at Richmond, which had for some time been fitting up for him under the superintendence of Mr. Rigby, who, as Coningsby also learnt, now permanently resided at Monmouth House. All this intelligence made Coningsby ponder. He was sufficiently acquainted with the parties concerned to feel assured that he had not learned the whole truth. What had really taken place, and what was the real cause of the occurrences, were equally mystical to him. All he was convinced of was that some great domestic revolution had been suddenly effected. Coningsby entertained for his grandfather a sincere affection. With the exception of their last unfortunate interview, he had experienced from Lord Monmouth nothing but kindness, both in phrase and deed. There was also something in Lord Monmouth, when he pleased it, rather fascinating to young men; and as Coningsby had never occasioned him any feelings but pleasurable ones, he was always disposed to make himself delightful to his grandson. The experience of a consummate man of the world, advanced in life, detailed without rigidity to youth, with frankness and facility, is bewitching. Lord Monmouth was never garrulous; he was always pithy, and could be picturesque. He revealed a character in a sentence, and detected the ruling passion with the hand of a master. Besides, he had seen everybody, and had done everything; and though on the whole too indolent for conversation, and loving to be talked to, These were circumstances which made his too rare communications the more precious. With these feelings, Coningsby resolved, the moment that he learned that his grandfather was established at Richmond, to pay him a visit. He was informed that Lord Monmouth was at home, and he was shown into a drawing-room, where he found two French ladies in their bonnets, whom he soon discovered to be actresses. They also had come down to pay a visit to his grandfather, and were by no means displeased to pass the interval that must elapse before they had that pleasure in chatting with his grandson. Coningsby found them extremely amusing, with the finest spirits in the world, imperturbable good temper, and an unconscious practical philosophy that defied the devil care and all his works. And well it was that he found such agreeable companions, for time flowed on, and no summons arrived to call him to his grandfather's presence, and no herald to announce his grandfather's advent. The ladies and Coningsby had exhausted badinage. They had examined and criticised all the furniture, had rifled the vases of their prettiest flowers, and Clotilde, who had already sung several times, was proposing a duet to Ermengarde, when a servant entered and told the ladies that a carriage was in attendance to give them an airing, and after that Lord Monmouth hoped they would return and dine with him. Then, turning to Coningsby, he informed him, with his lord's compliments, that Lord Monmouth was sorry he was too much engaged to see him. Nothing was to be done but to put a tolerably good face on it. "Embrace Lord Monmouth for me," said Coningsby to his fair friends, "and tell him I think it is very unkind that he did not ask me to dinner with you." Coningsby said this with a gay air, but really with a depressed spirit. He felt convinced that his grandfather was deeply displeased with him, and as he rode away from the villa he could not resist the strong impression that he was destined never to re-enter it. Yet it was decreed otherwise. It so happened that the idle message which Coningsby had left for his grandfather, and which he never seriously supposed for a moment that his late companions would have given their host, operated entirely in his favour. Whatever were the feelings with respect to Coningsby at the bottom of Lord Monmouth's heart, he was actuated in his refusal to see him not more from displeasure than from an anticipatory horror of something like a scene. Even a surrender from Coningsby without terms, and an offer to declare himself a candidate for Darlford, or to do anything else that his grandfather wished, would have been disagreeable to Lord Monmouth in his present mood. As in politics, a revolution is often followed by a season of torpor, so, in the case of Lord Monmouth, the separation from his wife, which had for a long period occupied his meditation, was succeeded by a vein of mental dissipation. He did not wish to be reminded by any thing or any person that he had still in some degree the misfortune of being a responsible member of society. He wanted to be surrounded by individuals who were above or below the conventional interests of what is called the world. He wanted to hear nothing of those painful and embarrassing influences which, from our contracted experience and want of enlightenment, we magnify into such undue importance. For this purpose he wished to have about him persons whose knowledge of the cares of life concerned only the means of existence, and whose sense of its objects referred only to the sources of enjoyment; persons who had not been educated in the idolatry of respectability, that is to say, of realising such an amount of what is termed character by a hypocritical deference to the prejudices of the community as may enable them, at suitable times and under convenient circumstances and disguises, to plunder the public. This was the Monmouth philosophy. With these feelings, Lord Monmouth recoiled at this moment from grandsons and relations and ties of all kinds. He did not wish to be reminded of his identity, but to swim unmolested and undisturbed in his Epicurean dream. When, therefore, his fair visitors, Clotilde, who opened her mouth only to breathe roses and diamonds, an Ermengarde who was so good-natured that she sacrificed even her lovers to her friends, saw him merely to exclaim at the same moment, and with the same voices of thrilling joyousness, "Why did not you ask him to dinner?" And then, without waiting for his reply, entered with that rapidity of elocution which French women can alone command into the catalogue of his charms and accomplishments, Lord Monmouth began to regret that he really had not seen Coningsby, who, it appeared, might have greatly contributed to the pleasure of the day. The message which was duly given, however, settled the business. Lord Monmouth felt that any chance of explanations, or even allusions to the past, was out of the question; and, to defend himself from the accusations of his animated guests, he said, "Well, he shall come to dine with you next time." There is no end to the influence of woman on our life. It is at the bottom of everything that happens to us. And so it was that, in spite of all the combinations of Lucretia and Mr. Rigby, and the mortification and resentment of Lord Monmouth, the favourable impression he casually made on a couple of French actresses occasioned Coningsby, before a month had elapsed since his memorable interview at Monmouth House, to receive an invitation again to dine with his grandfather. The party was agreeable. Clotilde and Ermengarde had wits as sparkling as their eyes. There was a manager of the opera, a great friend of Villebecque, and his wife, a splendid lady who had been a prima donna of celebrity, and still had a commanding voice for a chamber; a Carlist nobleman who lived upon his traditions, and who, though without a sou, could tell of a festival given by his family before the Revolution, which had cost 1,000,000 of francs; and a Neapolitan physician in whom Lord Monmouth had great confidence, and who himself believed in the elixir vitae, made up the party, with Lucian Gay, Coningsby, and Mr. Rigby. Our hero remarked that Villebecque on this occasion sat at the bottom of the table, but Flora did not appear. In the meantime, the month which brought about this satisfactory and at one time unexpected result was fruitful also in other circumstances still more interesting. Coningsby and Edith met frequently, if to breathe the same atmosphere in the same crowded saloons can be described as meeting; ever watching each other's movements, and yet studious never to encounter each other's glance. The charms of Miss Millbank had become a universal topic. They were celebrated in ball-rooms, they were discussed at clubs. Edith was the beauty of the season. All admired her; many sighed even to express their admiration; but the devotion of Lord Beaumanoir, who always hovered about her, deterred them from a rivalry which might have made the boldest despair. As for Coningsby, he passed his life principally with the various members of the Sidney family, and was almost daily riding with Lady Everingham and her sister, generally accompanied by Lord Henry and his friend Eustace Lyle, between whom, indeed, and Coningsby, there were relations of intimacy scarcely less inseparable. Coningsby had spoken to Lady Everingham of the rumoured marriage of her elder brother, and found, although the family had not yet been formally apprised of it, she entertained little doubt of its ultimate occurrence. She admired Miss Millbank, with whom her acquaintance continued slight, and she wished, of course, that her brother should marry and be happy. "But Percy is often in love," she would add, "and never likes us to be very intimate with his inamoratas. He thinks it destroys the romance, and that domestic familiarity may compromise his heroic character. However," she added, "I really believe that will be a match." On the whole, though he bore a serene aspect to the world, Coningsby passed this month in a state of restless misery. His soul was brooding on one subject, and he had no confidant. He could not resist the spell that impelled him to the society where Edith might at least be seen, and the circle in which he lived was one in which her name was frequently mentioned. Alone, in his solitary rooms in the Albany, he felt all his desolation, and often a few minutes before he figured in the world, apparently followed and courted by all, he had been plunged in the darkest fits of irremediable wretchedness. He had, of course, frequently met Lady Wallinger, but their salutations, though never omitted, and on each side cordial, were brief. There seemed to be a tacit understanding between them not to refer to a subject fruitful in painful reminiscences. The season waned. In the fulfilment of a project originally formed in the playing fields of Eton, often recurred to at Cambridge, and cherished with the fondness which men cling to a scheme of early youth, Coningsby, Henry Sidney, Vere, and Buckhurst had engaged some moors together this year, and in a few days they were about to quit town for Scotland. They had pressed Eustace Lyle to accompany them, but he, who in general seemed to have no pleasure greater than their society, had surprised them by declining their invitation with some vague mention that he rather thought he should go abroad. It was the last day of July, and all the world were at a breakfast given at a fanciful cottage situate in a beautiful garden on the banks of the Thames by Lady Everingham. The weather was as bright as the romances of Boccaccio. There were pyramids of strawberries in bowls colossal enough to hold orange trees, and the choicest band filled the air with enchanting strains, while a brilliant multitude sauntered on turf like velvet, or roamed in desultory existence amid the quivering shades of winding walks. "My fate was prophetic," said Lady Everingham, when she saw Coningsby. "I am glad it is connected with an incident. It gives it a point." "You are mystical as well as prophetic. Tell me what we are to celebrate." "Theresa is going to be married." "Then I too will prophesy and name the hero of the romance, Eustace Lyle." "You have been more prescient than I," said Lady Everingham, "perhaps because I was thinking too much of some one else." "It seems to me a union which all must acknowledge perfect. I hardly know which I love best. I have had my suspicions a long time, and when Eustace refused to go to the moors with us, though I said nothing, I was convinced." "At any rate," said Lady Everingham, sighing, with a rather smiling face, "we are kinsfolk, Mr. Coningsby, though I would gladly have wished to have been more." "Were those your thoughts, dear lady? Ever kind to me. Happiness," he added in a mournful tone, "I fear can never be mine." "And why?" "Ah, 'tis a tale too strange and sorrowful for a day when, like Seged, we must all determine to be happy." "You have already made me miserable." "Here comes a group that will make you gay," said Coningsby, as he moved on. Edith and the Wallingers, accompanied by Lord Beaumanoir, Mr. Melton, and Sir Charles Buckhurst, formed the party. They seemed profuse in their congratulations to Lady Everingham, having already learnt the intelligence from her brother. Coningsby stopped to talk to Lady St. Julians, who had still a daughter to marry. Both Augustina, who was at Coningsby Castle, and Clara Isabella, who ought to have been there, had each secured the right man. But Adelaide Victoria had now appeared, and Lady St. Julians had a great regard for the favourite grandson of Lord Monmouth, and also for the influential friend of Lord Vere and Sir Charles Buckhurst. In case Coningsby did not determine to become her son-in-law himself, he might counsel either of his friends to a judicious decision on an inevitable act. "Strawberries and cream?" said Lord Eskdale to Mr. Ormsby, who seemed occupied with some delicacies. "Egad, no, 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 those days are past. I think there is a little easterly wind with all this fine appearance." "I am for indoor nature myself," said Lord Eskdale. "Do you know, I do not half like the way Monmouth is going on. He never gets out of that villa of his. He should change his air more. Tell him." "It is no use telling him anything. Have you heard anything of Milady?" "I had a letter from her to day. She writes in good spirits. I am sorry it broke up, and yet I never thought it would last so long." "I gave them 2 years," said Mr. Ormsby. "Lord Monmouth lived with his first wife 2 years, and afterwards with the Mirandola at Milan at least nearly 2 years. It was 1 year and 10 months. I must know, for he called me in to settle affairs. I took the lady to the baths of Lucca on the pretence that Monmouth would meet us there. He went to Paris. All his great affairs have been 2 years. I remember I wanted to bet Cassilis at White's on it when he married. But I thought, being his intimate friend, the oldest friend he has, indeed, and one of his trustees, it was perhaps as well not to do it. "You should have made the bet with himself," said Lord Eskdale, "and then there never would have been a separation." "Ha, ha, ha! Do you know, I feel the wind." About an hour after this, Coningsby, who had just quitted the Duchess, met, on a terrace by the river, Lady Wallinger, walking with Mrs. Guy Flouncey and a Russian prince, whom that lady was enchanting. Coningsby was about to pass with some slight courtesy, but Lady Wallinger stopped and would speak to him on slight subjects, the weather and the fête, but yet adroitly enough managed to make him turn and join her. Mrs. Guy Flouncey walked on a little before with her Russian admirer. Lady Wallinger followed with Coningsby. "The match that has been proclaimed to day has greatly surprised me," said Lady Wallinger. "Indeed," said Coningsby. "I confess I was long prepared for it. And it seems to me the most natural alliance conceivable, and one that every one must approve." "Lady Everingham seems much surprised by it." "Ah, Lady Everingham is a brilliant personage, and cannot deign to observe obvious circumstances." "Do you know, Mr. Coningsby, that I always thought you were engaged to Lady Theresa?" "I?" "Indeed, we were informed more than a month ago that you were positively going to be married to her." "I am not one of those who can shift their affections with such rapidity, Lady Wallinger." Lady Wallinger looked distressed. "You remember our meeting, you on the stairs at House, Mr. Coningsby?" "Painfully. It is deeply graven on my brain." "Edith had just been informed that you were going to be married to Lady Theresa." "Not surely by him to whom she is herself going to be married," said Coningsby, reddening. "I am not aware that she is going to be married to any one. Lord Beaumanoir admires her, has always admired her. But Edith has given him no encouragement, at least gave him no encouragement as long as she believed. But why dwell on such an unhappy subject, Mr. Coningsby? I am to blame. I have been to blame perhaps before, but indeed I think it cruel, very cruel, that Edith and you are kept asunder. You have always been my best, my dearest friend, and are the most amiable and admirable of women. But tell me, is it indeed true that Edith is not going to be married?" At this moment Mrs. Guy Flouncey turned round, and assuring Lady Wallinger that the Prince and herself had agreed to refer some point to her about the most transcendental ethics of flirtation, this deeply interesting conversation was arrested, and Lady Wallinger, with becoming suavity, was obliged to listen to the lady's lively appeal of exaggerated nonsense, and the Prince's affected protests, while Coningsby walked by her side, pale and agitated, and then offered his arm to Lady Wallinger, which she accepted with an affectionate pressure. At the end of the terrace they met some other guests, and soon were immersed in the multitude that thronged the lawn. "There is Sir Joseph," said Lady Wallinger, and Coningsby looked up and saw Edith on his arm. They were unconsciously approaching them. Lord Beaumanoir was there, but he seemed to shrink into nothing to day before Buckhurst, who was captivated for the moment by Edith, and hearing that no knight was resolute enough to try a fall with the Marquess, was impelled by his talent for action to enter the lists. He had talked down everybody, unhorsed every cavalier, nobody had a chance against him, he answered all your questions before you asked them, contradicted everybody with the intrepidity of a Rigby, annihilated your anecdotes by historiettes infinitely more piquant, and if anybody chanced to make a joke which he could not excel, declared immediately that it was a Joe Miller. He was absurd, extravagant, grotesque, noisy, but he was young, rattling, and interesting from his health and spirits. Edith was extremely amused by him, and was encouraging by her smile his spiritual excesses, when they all suddenly met Lady Wallinger and Coningsby. The eyes of Edith and Coningsby met for the first time since they so cruelly encountered on the staircase of House. A deep quick blush suffused her face, her eyes gleamed with a sudden coruscation, and suddenly and quickly she put forth her hand. Yes, he presses once more that hand which permanently to retain is the passion of his life, yet which may never be his. It seemed that for the ravishing delight of that moment he could have borne with cheerfulness all the dark and harrowing misery of the year he had passed away since he embraced her in the woods of Hellingsley and pledged his faith by the waters of the rushing Darl. He seized the occasion which offered itself, a moment to walk by her side and to snatch some brief instants of unreserved communion. "Forgive me," she said. "Ah, how could you ever doubt me?" said Coningsby. "I was unhappy. And now we are to each other as before? And will be, come what come may." End of chapter 7. End of book 8. Section 30 of Coningsby or the New Generation by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 9, Chapter 1. It was Merry Christmas at St. Geneviève. There was a Yule log blazing on every hearth in that wide domain, from the hall of the squire to the peasant's roof. The buttery hatch was open for the whole week from noon to sunset. All comers might take their fill, and each carry away as much bold beef, white bread, and jolly ale as a strong man could bear in a basket with one hand. For every woman a red cloak, and a coat of broadcloth for every man. All day long carts laden with fuel and warm raiment were traversing the various districts, distributing comfort and dispensing cheer. For a Christian gentleman of high degree was Eustace Lyle. Within his hall, too, he holds revel, and his beauteous bride welcomes their guests, from her noble parents to the faithful tenants of the house. All classes are mingled in the joyous equality that becomes the season, at once sacred and merry. There are carols for the eventful eve, and mummers for the festive day. The Duke and Duchess and every member of the family had consented this year to keep their Christmas with the newly married couple. Coningsby, too, was there, and all his friends. The party was numerous, gay, hearty, and happy, for they were all united by sympathy. They were planning that Henry Sidney should be appointed Lord of Misrule, or ordained Abbot of Unreason at the least, so successful had been his revival of the mummers, the hobby horse not forgotten. Their host had entrusted to Lord Henry the restoration of many old observances, and the joyous feeling which this celebration of Christmas had diffused throughout an extensive district was a fresh argument in favour of Lord Henry's principle that a mere mechanical mitigation of the material necessities of the humbler classes, a mitigation which must inevitably be limited, can never alone avail sufficiently to ameliorate their condition, that their condition is not merely a knife and fork question, to use the coarse and shallow phrase of the utilitarian school, that a simple satisfaction of the grosser necessities of our nature will not make a happy people, that you must cultivate the heart as well as seek to content the belly, and that the surest means to elevate the character of the people is to appeal to their affections. There is nothing more interesting than to trace predisposition. An indefinite yet strong sympathy with the peasantry of the realm had been one of the characteristic sensibilities of Lord Henry at Eton. Yet a schoolboy, he had busied himself with their pastimes and the details of their cottage economy. As he advanced in life, the horizon of his views expanded with his intelligence and his experience. And the son of one of the noblest of our houses, to whom the delights of life are offered with fatal facility, on the very threshold of his career he devoted his time and thought, labour and life, to one vast and noble purpose, the elevation of the condition of the great body of the people. "I vote for Buckhurst being Lord of Misrule," said Lord Henry. "I will be content with being his gentleman usher." "It shall be put to the vote," said Lord Vere. "No one has a chance against Buckhurst," said Coningsby. "Now, Sir Charles," said Lady Everingham, "your absolute sway is about to commence. And what is your will?" "The first thing must be my formal installation," said Buckhurst. I vote the boar's head be carried in procession thrice round the hall, and Beau shall be the champion to challenge all who may question my right. Duke, you shall be my chief butler, the Duchess my herb woman. She is to walk before me and scatter rosemary. Coningsby shall carry the boar's head, Lady Theresa and Lady Everingham shall sing the canticle, Lord Everingham shall be marshal of the lists, and put all in the stocks who are found sober and decorous. Lisle shall be the palmer from the Holy Land, and Vere shall ride the hobby horse. Some must carry cups of hypocras, some lighted tapers, all must join in the chorus. He ceased his instructions, and all hurried away to carry them into effect. Some hastily arrayed themselves in fanciful dresses, the ladies in robes of white with garlands of flowers. Some drew pieces of armour from the wall, and decked themselves with helm and hauberk. Others waved ancient banners. They brought in the boar's head on a large silver dish, and Coningsby raised it aloft. They formed into procession, the Duchess distributing rosemary, Buckhurst swaggering with all the majesty of Tamerlane, his mock court irresistibly humorous with their servility, and the sweet voice of Lady Everingham chanting the first verse of the canticle, followed in the second by the rich tones of Lady Theresa. Caput apri defero, redens laudes Domino. The boar's head in hand bring I, with garlands gay and rosemary. I pray you all sing merrily, qui estis in convivio. Caput apri defero, redens laudes Domino. The boar's head, I understand, is the chief service in this land. Look wherever it be fand, servite cum cantico. The procession thrice paraded the hall. Then they stopped, and the Lord of Misrule ascended his throne, and his courtiers formed round him in a circle. Behind him they held the ancient banners, and waved their glittering arms, and placed on a lofty and illuminated pedestal the boar's head covered with garlands. It was a good picture, and the Lord of Misrule sustained his part with untiring energy. He was addressing his court in a pompous rhapsody of merry nonsense, when a servant approached Coningsby and told him that he was wanted without. Our hero retired unperceived. A dispatch had arrived for him from London. Without any prescience of its purpose, he nevertheless broke the seal with a trembling hand. His presence was immediately desired in town. Lord Monmouth was dead. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. This was a crisis of the life of Coningsby, yet, like many critical epochs, the person most interested in it was not sufficiently aware of its character. The first feeling which he experienced at the intelligence was sincere affliction. He was fond of his grandfather, had received great kindness from him, and at a period of life when it was most welcome. The neglect and hardships of his early years, instead of leaving a prejudice against one who, by some, might be esteemed their author, had, by their contrast, only rendered Coningsby more keenly sensible of the solicitude and enjoyment which had been lavished on his happy youth. The next impression on his mind was undoubtedly a natural and reasonable speculation on the effect of this bereavement on his fortunes. Lord Monmouth had more than once assured Coningsby that he had provided for him as became a near relative to whom he was attached, and in a manner which ought to satisfy the wants and wishes of an English gentleman. The allowance which Lord Monmouth had made him, as considerable as usually accorded to the eldest sons of wealthy peers, might justify him in estimating his future patrimony as extremely ample. He was aware, indeed, that at a subsequent period his grandfather had projected for him fortunes of a still more elevated character. He looked to Coningsby as the future representative of an ancient barony, and had been purchasing territory with the view of supporting the title. But Coningsby did not by any means firmly reckon on these views being realised. He had a suspicion that in thwarting the wishes of his grandfather in not becoming a candidate for Darlford, he had at the moment arrested arrangements which, from the tone of Lord Monmouth's communication, he believed were then in progress for that purpose, and he thought it improbable, with his knowledge of his grandfather's habits, that Lord Monmouth had found either time or inclination to resume before his decease the completion of these plans. Indeed, there was a period when, in adopting the course which he pursued with respect to Darlford, Coningsby was well aware that he perilled more than the large fortune which was to accompany the barony. Had not a separation between Lord Monmouth and his wife taken place simultaneously with Coningsby's difference with his grandfather, he was conscious that the consequences might have been even altogether fatal to his prospects, but the absence of her evil influence at such a conjuncture, its permanent removal indeed from the scene, coupled with his fortunate though not formal reconciliation with Lord Monmouth, had long ago banished from his memory all those apprehensions to which he had felt it impossible at the time to shut his eyes. Before he left town for Scotland, he had made a farewell visit to his grandfather, who, though not as cordial as in old days, had been gracious; and Coningsby, during his excursion to the moors and his various visits to the country, had continued at intervals to write to his grandfather, as had been for some years his custom. On the whole, with an indefinite feeling, which, in spite of many a rational effort, did nevertheless haunt his mind, that this great and sudden event might exercise a vast and beneficial influence on his worldly position, Coningsby could not but feel some consolation in the affliction which he sincerely experienced, in the hope that he might at all events now offer to Edith a home worthy of her charms, her virtues, and her love. Although he had not seen her since their hurried yet sweet reconciliation in the gardens of Lady Everingham, Coningsby was never long without indirect intelligence of the incidents of her life; and the correspondence between Lady Everingham and Henry Sidney, while they were at the moors, had apprised him that Lord Beaumanoir's suit had terminated unsuccessfully almost immediately after his brother had quitted London. It was late in the evening when Coningsby arrived in town. He called at once on Lord Eskdale, who was one of Lord Monmouth's executors, and he persuaded Coningsby, whom he saw depressed, to dine with him alone. "You should not be seen at a club," said the good-natured peer, "and I remember myself in old days what was the wealth of an Albanian larder." Lord Eskdale at dinner talked frankly of the disposition of Lord Monmouth's property. He spoke as a matter of course that Coningsby was his grandfather's principal heir. "I don't know whether you will be happier with a large fortune," said Lord Eskdale. "It is a troublesome thing; nobody is satisfied with what you do with it, very often not yourself. To maintain an equable expenditure, not to spend too much on one thing, too little on another, is an art. There must be a harmony, a keeping in disbursement which very few men have. Great wealth varies. The thing to have is about 10,000 a year, and the world to think you have only 5. There is some enjoyment then, one is let alone; but the instant you have a large fortune, duties commence, and then impudent fellows borrow your money, and if you ask them for it again, they go about town saying you are a screw." Lord Monmouth had died suddenly at his Richmond villa, which latterly he never quitted, at a little supper, with no persons near him but those who were amusing. He suddenly found he could not lift his glass to his lips, and being extremely polite, waited a few minutes before he asked Clotilde, who was singing a sparkling drinking song, to do him that service. When, in accordance with his request, she reached him, it was too late. The ladies shrieked, being frightened. At first they were in despair, but after reflection they evinced some intention of plundering the house. Villebecque, who was absent at the moment, arrived in time, and everybody became orderly and broken-hearted. The body had been removed to Monmouth House, where it had been embalmed and laid in state. The funeral was not numerously attended. There was nobody in town. Some distinguished connections, however, came up from the country, though it was a period inconvenient for such movements. After the funeral, the will was to be read in the principal saloon of Monmouth House, one of those gorgeous apartments that had excited the boyish wonder of Coningsby on his first visit to that paternal roof, and now hung in black, adorned with the escutcheon of the deceased peer. The testamentary dispositions of the late lord were still unknown, though the names of his executors had been announced by his family solicitor, in whose custody the will and codicils had always remained. The executors under the will were Lord Eskdale, Mr. Ormsby, and Mr. Rigby. By a subsequent appointment Sidonia had been added. All of these individuals were now present. Coningsby, who had been chief mourner, stood on the right hand of the solicitor, who sat at the end of a long table, round which in groups were ranged all who had attended the funeral, including several of the superior members of the household, among them M. Vilbeck. The solicitor rose and explained that though Lord Monmouth had been in the habit of very frequently adding codicils to his will, the original will, however changed or modified, had never been revoked. It was therefore necessary to commence by reading that instrument. So saying, he sat down, and breaking the seals of a large packet, he produced the will of Philip Augustus, Marquess of Monmouth, which had been retained in his custody since its execution. By this will, of the date of 1829, the sum of £10,000 was left to Coningsby, then unknown to his grandfather, the same sum to Mr. Rigby. There was a great number of legacies, none of superior amount, most of them of less. These were chiefly to old male companions and women in various countries. There was an almost inconceivable number of small annuities to faithful servants, decayed actors, and obscure foreigners. The residue of his personal estate was left to 4 gentlemen, 3 of whom had quitted this world before the legator. The bequests therefore had lapsed. The 4th residuary legatee, in whom, according to the terms of the will, all would have consequently centred, was Mr. Rigby. There followed several codicils which did not materially affect the previous disposition, one of them leaving a legacy of £20,000 to the Princess Colonna, until they arrived at the latter part of the year 1832, when a codicil increased the £10,000 left under the will to Coningsby to £50,000. After Coningsby's visit to the castle in 1836, a very important change occurred in the disposition of Lord Monmouth's estate. The legacy of £50,000 in his favour was revoked, and the same sum left to the Princess Lucretia. A similar amount was bequeathed to Mr. Rigby, and Coningsby was left sole residuary legatee. The marriage led to a considerable modification. An estate of about £9,000 a year, which Lord Monmouth had himself purchased, and was therefore in his own disposition, was left to Coningsby. The legacy to Mr. Rigby was reduced to £20,000, and the whole of his residue left to his issue by Lady Monmouth. In case he died without issue, the estate bequeathed to Coningsby to be taken into account, and the residue then to be divided equally between Lady Monmouth and his grandson. It was under this instrument that Sidonia had been appointed an executor, and to whom Lord Monmouth left, among others, the celebrated picture of the Holy Family by Murillo, as his friend had often admired it. To Lord Eskdale he left all his female miniatures, and to Mr. Ormsby his rare and splendid collection of French novels, and all his wines except his Tokay, which he left with his library to Sir Robert Peel, though this legacy was afterwards revoked in consequence of Sir Robert's conduct about the Irish corporations. The solicitor paused, and begged permission to send for a glass of water. While this was arranging, there was a murmur at the lower part of the room, but little disposition to conversation among those in the vicinity of the lawyer. Coningsby was silent, his brow a little knit. Mr. Rigby was pale and restless, but said nothing. Mr. Ormsby took a pinch of snuff, and offered his box to Lord Eskdale, who was next to him. They exchanged glances, and made some observation about the weather. Sidonia stood apart, with his arms folded. He had not, of course, attended the funeral, nor had he as yet exchanged any recognition with Coningsby. "Now, gentlemen," said the solicitor, "if you please, I will proceed." They came to the year 1839, the year Coningsby was at Hellingsley. This appeared to be a critical period in the fortunes of Lady Monmouth, while Coningsby's reached to the culminating point. Mr. Rigby was reduced to his original legacy under the will of £10,000. A sum of equal amount was bequeathed to Armand Vilbec in acknowledgment of faithful services. All the dispositions in favour of Lady Monmouth were revoked, and she was limited to her moderate jointure of £3,000 per annum under the marriage settlement, while everything without reserve was left absolutely to Coningsby. A subsequent codicil determined that the £10,000 left to Mr. Rigby should be equally divided between him and Lucian Gay, but as some compensation Lord Monmouth left to the Right Honourable Nicholas Rigby the bust of that gentleman, which he had himself presented to his lordship, and which, at his desire, had been placed in the vestibule at Coningsby Castle, from the amiable motive that after Lord Monmouth's decease Mr. Rigby might wish, perhaps, to present it to some other friend. Lord Eskdale and Mr. Ormsby took care not to catch the eye of Mr. Rigby. As for Coningsby, he saw nobody. He maintained, during the extraordinary situation in which he was placed, a firm demeanour, but serene and regulated as he appeared to the spectators, his nerves were really strung to a high pitch. There was yet another codicil. It bore the date of June 1840, and was made at Brighton immediately after the separation with Lady Monmouth. It was the sight of this instrument that sustained Rigby at this great emergency. He had a wild conviction that after all it must set all right. He felt assured that as Lady Monmouth had already been disposed of, it must principally refer to the disinheritance of Coningsby, secured by Rigby's well-timed and malignant misrepresentations of what had occurred in Lancashire during the preceding summer. And then to whom could Lord Monmouth leave his money? However he might cut and carve up his fortunes, Rigby, and especially at a moment when he had so served him, must come in for a considerable slice. His prescient mind was right. All the dispositions in favour of my grandson Harry Coningsby were revoked, and he inherited from his grandfather only the interest of the sum of £10,000, which had been originally bequeathed to him in his orphan boyhood. The executors had the power of investing the principal in any way they thought proper for his advancement in life, provided always it was not placed in the capital stock of any manufactory. Coningsby turned pale. He lost his abstracted look. He caught the eye of Rigby. He read the latent malice of that nevertheless anxious countenance. What passed through the mind and being of Coningsby was thought and sensation enough for a year, but it was as the flash that reveals a whole country, yet ceases to be ere one can say it lightens. There was a revelation to him of an inward power that should baffle these conventional calamities, a natural and sacred confidence in his youth and health and knowledge and convictions. Even the recollection of Edith was not unaccompanied with some sustaining associations. At least the mightiest foe to their union was departed. All this was the impression of an instant, simultaneous with the reading of the words of form with which the last testamentary disposition of the Marquess of Monmouth left the sum of £30,000 to Armand Vilbec, and all the rest, residue and remainder of his unentailed property, wheresoever and whatsoever it might be, amounting in value to nearly £1,000,000, was given, devised, and bequeathed to Flora, commonly called Flora Vilbec, the stepchild of the said Armand Vilbec, but who is my natural daughter, by Marie Estelle Matteau, an actress at the Théâtre Français in the years 1811 to 15, by the name of Stella. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. This is a crash, said Coningsby, with a grave rather than agitated countenance, to Sidonia, as his friend came up to greet him, without, however, any expression of condolence. This time next year you will not think so, said Sidonia. Coningsby shrugged his shoulders. The principal annoyance of this sort of miscarriage, said Sidonia, is the condolence of the gentle world. I think we may now depart. I am going home to dine. Come and discuss your position. For the present we will not speak of it." So saying, Sidonia good-naturedly got Coningsby out of the room. They walked together to Sidonia's house in Carlton Gardens, neither of them making the slightest allusion to the catastrophe. Sidonia inquiring where he had been, what he had been doing since they last met, and himself conversing in his usual vein, though with a little more feeling in his manner than was his custom. When they had arrived there, Sidonia ordered their dinner instantly, and during the interval between the command and its appearance, he called Coningsby's attention to an old German painting he had just received, its brilliant colouring and quaint costumes. "Eat, and an appetite will come," said Sidonia, when he observed Coningsby somewhat reluctant. "Take some of that Chablis. It will put you right. You will find it delicious." In this way some 20 minutes passed. Their meal was over, and they were alone together. "I have been thinking all this time of your position," said Sidonia. "A sorry one, I fear," said Coningsby. "I really cannot see that," said his friend. "You have experienced this morning a disappointment, but not a calamity. If you had lost your eye, it would have been a calamity. No combination of circumstances could have given you another. There are really no miseries except natural miseries. Conventional misfortunes are mere illusions. What seems conventionally, in a limited view, a great misfortune, if subsequently viewed in its results, is often the happiest incident in one's life." "I hope the day may come when I may feel this." "Now is the moment when philosophy is of use. That is to say, now is the moment when you should clearly comprehend the circumstances which surround you. Holiday philosophy is mere idleness. You think, for example, that you have just experienced a great calamity because you have lost the fortune on which you counted?" "I must say I do." "I ask you again, which would you have rather lost, your grandfather's inheritance or your right leg?" "Most certainly my inheritance." "Or your left arm?" "Still the inheritance." "Would you have received the inheritance on condition that your front teeth should be knocked out?" "No." "Would you have given up a year of your life for the fortune trebled?" "Even at 23 I would have refused the terms." "Come, come, Coningsby, the calamity cannot be very great." "Why, you have put it in an ingenious point of view, and yet it is not so easy to convince a man that he should be content who has lost everything." "You have a great many things at this moment that you separately prefer to the fortune that you have forfeited. How then can you be said to have lost everything?" "What have I?" said Coningsby, despondingly. "You have health, youth, good looks, great abilities, considerable knowledge, a fine courage, a lofty spirit, and no contemptible experience. With each of these qualities one might make a fortune. The combination ought to command the highest." "You console me," said Coningsby, with a faint blush and a fainter smile. "I teach you the truth. That is always solacing. I think you are a most fortunate young man. I should not have thought you more fortunate if you had been your grandfather's heir. Perhaps less so. But I wish you to comprehend your position. If you understand it, you will cease to lament." "But what should I do?" "Bring your intelligence to bear on the right object. I make you no offers of fortune, because I know you would not accept them, and indeed I have no wish to see you a lounger in life. If you had inherited a great patrimony, it is possible your natural character and previous culture might have saved you from its paralysing influence. But it is a question, even with you. Now you are free. That is to say, you are free if you are not in debt. A man who has not seen the world, whose fancy is harassed with glittering images of pleasures he has never experienced, cannot live on £300 a year. But you can. You have nothing to haunt your thoughts or disturb the abstraction of your studies. You have seen the most beautiful women. You have banqueted in palaces. You know what heroes and wits and statesmen are made of. And you can draw on your memory instead of your imagination for all those dazzling and interesting objects that make the inexperienced restless, and are the cause of what are called scrapes. But you can do nothing if you be in debt. You must be free. Before, therefore, we proceed, I must beg you to be frank on this head. If you have any absolute or contingent encumbrances, tell me of them without reserve, and permit me to clear them at once to any amount. You will sensibly oblige me in so doing, because I am interested in watching your career, and if the racers start with a clog, my psychological observations will be imperfect. You are indeed a friend, and had I debts I would ask you to pay them. I have nothing of the kind. My grandfather was so lavish in his allowance to me that I never got into difficulties. Besides, there are horses and things without end which I must sell, and money at Drummond's. That will produce your outfit, whatever the course you adopt. I conceive there are two careers which deserve your consideration. In the first place, there is diplomacy. If you decide upon that, I can assist you. There exist between me and the minister such relations that I can at once secure you that first step which is so difficult to obtain. After that, much, if not all, depends on yourself. But I could advance you, provided you were capable. You should at least not languish for want of preferment. In an important post, I could throw in your way advantages which would soon permit you to control cabinets. Information commands the world. I doubt not your success, and for such a career, speedy. Let us assume it is a fact. Is it a result satisfactory? Suppose yourself in a dozen years a plenipotentiary at a chief court, or at a critical post with a red ribbon and the Privy Council in immediate perspective, and after a lengthened career, a pension and a peerage. Would that satisfy you? You don't look excited. I am hardly surprised. In your position it would not satisfy me. A diplomatist is, after all, a phantom. There is a want of nationality about his being. I always look upon diplomatists as the Hebrews of politics, without country, political creeds, popular convictions, that strong reality of existence which pervades the career of an eminent citizen in a free and great country. You read my thoughts, said Coningsby. I should be sorry to sever myself from England. There remains then the other, the greater, the nobler career, said Sidonia, which in England may give you all, the bar. I am absolutely persuaded that with the requisite qualifications and with perseverance, success at the bar is certain. It may be retarded or precipitated by circumstances, but cannot be ultimately effected. You have a right to count with your friends on no lack of opportunities when you are ripe for them. You appear to me to have all the qualities necessary for the bar, and you may count on that perseverance which is indispensable for the reason I have before mentioned, because it will be sustained by your experience. I have resolved, said Coningsby. I will try for the Great Seal. End of chapter 3. Section 31 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 9, Chapter 4. Alone in his chambers, no longer under the sustaining influence of Sidonia's converse and counsel, the shades of night descending and bearing gloom to the gloomy, all the excitement of his spirit evaporated, the heart of Coningsby sank. All now depended on himself, and in that self he had no trust. Why should he succeed? Success was the most rare of results. Thousands fail, units triumph. And even success could only be conducted to him by the course of many years. His career, even if prosperous, was now to commence by the greatest sacrifice which the heart of man could be called upon to sustain. Upon the stern altar of his fortunes he must now immolate his first and enduring love. Before he had a perilous position to offer Edith. Now he had none. The future might then have aided them. There was no combination which could improve his present. Under any circumstances he must, after all his thoughts and studies, commence a new novitiate, and before he could enter the arena must pass years of silent and obscure preparation. 'Twas very bitter. He looked up, his eye caught that drawing of the towers of Hellingsley which she had given him in the days of their happy hearts. That was all that was to remain of their loves. He was to bear it to the future scene of his labours, to remind him through revolving years of toil and routine that he too had had his romance, had roamed in fair gardens, and whispered in willing ears the secrets of his passion. That drawing was to become the altarpiece of his life. Coningsby passed an agitated night of broken sleep, waking often with the consciousness of having experienced some great misfortune, yet with an indefinite conception of its nature. He woke exhausted and dispirited. It was a gloomy day, a raw north-easter blowing up the cloisters of the Albany, in which the fog was lingering, the newspaper on his breakfast table full of rumoured particulars of his grandfather's will, which had of course been duly digested by all who knew him. What a contrast to St. Geneviève! To the bright bracing morn of that merry Christmas! That radiant and cheerful scene, and those gracious and beaming personages, seemed another world and order of beings to the one he now inhabited, and the people with whom he must now commune. The Great Seal, indeed! It was the wild excitement of despair, the frenzied hope that blends inevitably with absolute ruin, that could alone have inspired such a hallucination. His unstrung heart deserted him, his energies could rally no more. He gave orders that he was at home to no one, and in his morning gown and slippers, with his feet resting on the fireplace, the once high-souled and noble-hearted Coningsby delivered himself up to despair. The day passed in a dark trance rather than a reverie. Nothing rose to his consciousness. He was like a particle of chaos at the best, a glimmering entity of some shadowy Hades. Towards evening the wind changed, the fog dispersed, there came a clear starry night, brisk and bright. Coningsby roused himself, dressed, and wrapping his cloak around him, sallied forth. Once more in the mighty streets, surrounded by millions, his petty griefs and personal fortunes assumed their proper position. Well had Sidonia taught him, view everything in its relation to the rest. 'Tis the secret of all wisdom. Here was the mightiest of modern cities, the rival even of the most celebrated of the ancient. Whether he inherited or forfeited fortunes, what was it to the passing throng? They would not share his splendour, or his luxury, or his comfort. But a word from his lip, a thought from his brain, expressed at the right time, at the right place, might turn their hearts, might influence their passions, might change their opinions, might affect their destiny. Nothing is great but the personal. As civilization advances, the accidents of life become each day less important. The power of man, his greatness and his glory, depend on essential qualities. Brains every day become more precious than blood. You must give men new ideas, you must teach them new words, you must modify their manners, you must change their laws, you must root out prejudices, subvert convictions, if you wish to be great. Greatness no longer depends on rentals, the world is too rich, nor on pedigrees, the world is too knowing. The greatness of this city destroys my misery, said Coningsby, and my genius shall conquer its greatness. This conviction of power in the midst of despair was a revelation of intrinsic strength. It is indeed the test of a creative spirit. From that moment all petty fears for an ordinary future quitted him. He felt that he must be prepared for great sacrifices, for infinite suffering, that there must devolve on him a bitter inheritance of obscurity, struggle, envy and hatred, vulgar prejudice, base criticism, petty hostilities. But the dawn would break and the hour arrive when the welcome morning hymn of his success and his fame would sound and be re-echoed. He returned to his rooms, calm, resolute. He slept the deep sleep of a man void of anxiety, that has neither hope nor fear to haunt his visions, but is prepared to rise on the morrow collected for the great human struggle. And the morning came. Fresh, vigorous, not rash or precipitate, yet determined to lose no time in idle meditation, Coningsby, already resolved at once to quit his present residence, was projecting a visit to some legal quarter where he intended in future to reside, when his servant brought him a note. The handwriting was feminine. The note was from Flora. The contents were brief. She begged Mr. Coningsby with great earnestness to do her the honour and the kindness of calling on her at his earliest convenience at the hotel in Brook Street where she now resided. It was an interview which Coningsby would rather have avoided, yet it seemed to him, after a moment's reflection, neither just, nor kind, nor manly, to refuse her request. Flora had not injured him. She was, after all, his kin. Was it for a moment to be supposed that he was envious of her lot? He replied, therefore, that in an hour he would wait upon her. In an hour, then, two individuals are to be brought together whose first meeting was held under circumstances most strangely different. Then Coningsby was the patron, a generous and spontaneous one, of a being obscure, almost friendless, and sinking under bitter mortification. His favour could not be the less appreciated because he was the chosen relative of a powerful noble. That noble was no more. His vast inheritance had devolved on the disregarded, even despised actress, whose suffering emotions Coningsby had then soothed, and whose fortune had risen on the destruction of all his prospects and the baulk of all his aspirations. Flora was alone when Coningsby was ushered into the room. The extreme delicacy of her appearance was increased by her deep mourning, and seated in a cushioned chair, from which she seemed to rise with an effort, she certainly presented little of the character of a fortunate and prosperous heiress. "You are very good to come to me," she said, faintly smiling. Coningsby extended his hand to her affectionately, in which she placed her own, looking down much embarrassed. "You have an agreeable situation here," said Coningsby, trying to break the first awkwardness of their meeting. "Yes, but I hope not to stop here long." "You are going abroad?" "No, I hope never to leave England." There was a slight pause, and then Flora sighed and said, "I wish to speak to you on a subject that gives me pain, yet of which I must speak. You think I have injured you?" "I am sure," said Coningsby, in a tone of great kindness, "that you could injure no one." "I have robbed you of your inheritance." "It was not mine by any right, legal or moral. There were others who might have urged an equal claim to it, and there are many who will now think that you might have preferred a superior one." "You had enemies. I was not one. They sought to benefit themselves by injuring you. They have not benefited themselves. Let them not say that they have at least injured you." "We will not care what they say," said Coningsby. "I can sustain my lot." "Would that I could mine," said Flora. She sighed again with a downcast glance. Then looking up, embarrassed and blushing deeply, she added, "I wish to restore to you that fortune of which I have unconsciously and unwillingly deprived you." "The fortune is yours, dear Flora, by every right," said Coningsby, much moved, "and there is no one who wishes more fervently that it may contribute to your happiness than I do." "It is killing me," said Flora, mournfully. Then, speaking with unusual animation, with a degree of excitement, she continued, "I must tell you what I feel. This fortune is yours. I am happy in the inheritance, if you generously receive it from me, because Providence has made me the means of baffling your enemies. I never thought to be so happy as I shall be, if you will generously accept this fortune, always intended for you. I have lived then for a purpose. I have not lived in vain. I have returned to you some service, however humble, for all your goodness to me in my unhappiness." "You are, as I have ever thought you, the kindest and most tender-hearted of beings. But you misconceive our mutual positions, my gentle Flora. The custom of the world does not permit such acts to either of us as you contemplate. The fortune is yours. It is left you by one on whose affections you had the highest claim. I will not say that so large an inheritance does not bring with it an alarming responsibility, but you are not unequal to it. Have confidence in yourself. You have a good heart, you have good sense, you have a well-principled being. Your spirit will mount with your fortunes and blend with them. You will be happy. And you? I shall soon learn to find content, if not happiness, from other sources, said Coningsby, and mere riches, however vast, could at no time have secured my felicity. But they may secure that which brings felicity, said Flora, speaking in a choking voice and not meeting the glance of Coningsby. You had some views in life which displease him who has done all this. They may be, they must be, affected by this fatal caprice. Speak to me, for I cannot speak, dear Mr. Coningsby. Do not let me believe that I, who would sacrifice my life for your happiness, am the cause of such calamities. Whatever be my lot, I repeat I can sustain it, said Coningsby, with a cheek of scarlet. Ah, he is angry with me, exclaimed Flora. He is angry with me, and the tears stole down her pale cheek. No, 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 dear Flora, I have no other feelings to you than those of affection and respect, and Coningsby, much agitated, drew his chair nearer to her and took her hand. I am gratified by these kind wishes, though they are utterly impracticable, but they are the witnesses of your sweet disposition and your noble spirit. There never shall exist between us, under any circumstances, other feelings than those of kin and kindness. He rose as if to depart. When she saw that, she started, and seemed to summon all her energies. You are going, she exclaimed, and I have said nothing, and I shall never see you again. Let me tell you what I mean. This fortune is yours. It must be yours. It is an arrow in my heart. Do not think I am speaking from a momentary impulse. I know myself. I have lived so much alone, I have had so little to deceive or to delude me, that I know myself. If you will not let me do justice, you declare my doom. I cannot live if my existence is the cause of all your prospects being blasted, and the sweetest dreams of your life being defeated. When I die, these riches will be yours, that you cannot prevent. Refuse my present offer, and you seal the fate of that unhappy Flora, whose fragile life has hung for years on the memory of your kindness. You must not say these words, dear Flora. You must not indulge in these gloomy feelings. You must live, and you must live happily. You have every charm and virtue which should secure happiness. The duties and the affections of existence will fall to your lot. It is one that will always interest me, for I shall ever be your friend. You have conferred on me one of the most delightful of feelings, gratitude, and for that I bless you. I will soon see you again. Mournfully he bade her farewell. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. About a week after this interview with Flora, as Coningsby one morning was about to sally forth from the Albany to visit some chambers in the Temple, to which his notice had been attracted, there was a loud ring, a bustle in the hall, and Henry Sidney and Buckhurst were ushered in. There never was such a cordial meeting, and yet the faces of his friends were serious. The truth is, the paragraphs in the newspapers had circulated in the country. They had written to Coningsby, and after a brief delay he had confirmed their worst apprehensions. Immediately they came up to town. Henry Sidney, a younger son, could offer little but sympathy, but he declared it was his intention also to study for the bar, so that they should not be divided. Buckhurst, after many embraces and some ordinary talk, took Coningsby aside and said, "My dear fellow, I have no objection to Henry Sidney hearing everything I say, but still these are subjects which men like to be discussed in private. Of course I expect you to share my fortune. There is enough for both. We will have an exact division." There was something in Buckhurst's fervent resolution very lovable and a little humorous, just enough to put one in good temper with human nature and life. If there were any fellow's fortune in the world that Coningsby would share, Buckhurst's would have had the preference; but while he pressed his hand, and with the glance in which a tear and a smile seemed to contend for mastery, he gently indicated why such arrangements were, with our present manners, impossible. 'I see,' said Buckhurst, after a moment's thought. 'I quite agree with you. The thing cannot be done; and to tell you the truth, a fortune is a bore. What I vote that we three do at once is, to take plenty of ready money and enter the Austrian service. By Jove, it is the only thing to do.' 'There is something in that,' said Coningsby. 'In the meantime, suppose you two fellows walk with me to the Temple, for I have an appointment to look at some chambers.' It was a fine day, and it was by no means a gloomy walk. Though the two friends had arrived full of indignation against Lord Monmouth, and miserable about their companion, once more in his society, and finding little difference in his carriage, they assumed unconsciously their habitual tone. As for Buckhurst, he was delighted with the Temple, which he visited for the first time. The name enchanted him. The tombs in the church convinced him that the Crusades were the only career. He would have himself become a law student if he might have prosecuted his studies in chain armour. The calmer Henry Sydney was consoled for the misfortunes of Coningsby by a fanciful project himself to pass a portion of his life amid these halls and courts, gardens and terraces, that maintain in the heart of a great city in the 19th century so much of the grave romance and picturesque decorum of our past manners. Henry Sydney was sanguine. He was reconciled to the disinheritance of Coningsby by the conviction that it was a providential dispensation to make him a Lord Chancellor. These faithful friends remained in town with Coningsby until he was established in Paper Buildings, and had become a pupil of a celebrated special pleader. They would have remained longer had not he himself suggested that it was better that they should part. It seemed a terrible catastrophe after all the visions of their boyish days, their college dreams, and their dazzling adventures in the world. 'And this is the end of Coningsby, the brilliant Coningsby that we all loved, that was to be our leader,' said Buckhurst to Lord Henry, as they quitted him. 'Well, come what may, life has lost something of its bloom.' 'The great thing now,' said Lord Henry, 'is to keep up the chain of our friendship. We must write to him very often, and contrive to be frequently together. It is dreadful to think that in the ways of life our hearts may become estranged. I never felt more wretched than I do at this moment, and yet I have faith that we shall not lose him.' 'Amen,' said Buckhurst. 'But I feel my plan about the Austrian service was, after all, the only thing. The Continent offers a career. He might have been Prime Minister; several strangers have been; and as for war, look at Brown and Laudon, and half a hundred others. I had a much better chance of being a Field Marshal than he has of being a Lord Chancellor.' 'I feel quite convinced that Coningsby will be Lord Chancellor,' said Henry Sydney gravely. The change of life for Coningsby was a great social revolution. It was sudden and complete. Within a month after the death of his grandfather, his name had been erased from all his fashionable clubs, and his horses and carriages sold, and he had become a student of the Temple. He entirely devoted himself to his new pursuit. His being was completely absorbed in it. There was nothing to haunt his mind, no unexperienced scene or sensation of life to distract his intelligence. One sacred thought alone indeed there remained, shrined in the innermost sanctuary of his heart and consciousness. But it was a tradition, no longer a hope. The moment that he had fairly recovered from the first shock of his grandfather's will, had clearly ascertained the consequences to himself, and had resolved on the course to pursue, he had communicated unreservedly with Oswald Millbank, and had renounced those pretensions to the hand of his sister which it ill became the destitute to prefer. His letter was answered in person. Millbank met Henry Sydney and Buckhurst at the chambers of Coningsby. Once more they were all four together, But under what different circumstances, and with what different prospects from those which attended their separation at Eton! Alone with Coningsby, Millbank spoke to him things which letters could not convey. He bore to him all the sympathy and devotion of Edith, but they would not conceal from themselves that at this moment, and in the present state of affairs, all was hopeless. In no way did Coningsby ever permit himself to intimate to Oswald the cause of his disinheritance. He was, of course, silent on it to his other friends, as any communication of the kind must have touched on a subject that was consecrated in his inmost soul. End of chapter 5. Section 32 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 9, Chapter 6. The state of political parties in England in the spring of 1841 offered a most remarkable contrast to their condition at the period commemorated in the first chapter of this work. The banners of the Conservative camp at this moment lowered on the Whig forces, as the gathering host of the Norman invader frowned on the coast of Sussex. The Whigs were not yet conquered, but they were doomed, and they themselves knew it. The mistake which was made by the Conservative leaders in not retaining office in 1839, and whether we consider their conduct in a national and constitutional light, or as a mere question of political tactics and party prudence, it was unquestionably a great mistake, had infused into the core of Whig authority a kind of galvanic action which only the superficial could mistake for vitality. Even to form a basis for their future operations after the conjuncture of '39, the Whigs were obliged to make a fresh inroad on the revenue, the daily increasing debility of which was now arresting attention and exciting public alarm. It was clear that the catastrophe of the government would be financial. Under all the circumstances of the case, the conduct of the Whig cabinet in their final propositions cannot be described as deficient either in boldness or prudence. The policy which they recommended was in itself a sagacious and spirited policy, but they erred in supposing that at the period it was brought forward, any measure promoted by the Whigs could have obtained general favour in the country. The Whigs were known to be feeble, they were looked upon as tricksters, the country knew they were opposed by a powerful party, and though there certainly never was any authority for the belief, the country did believe that that powerful party were influenced by great principles, had in their view a definite and national policy, and would secure to England, instead of a feeble administration and fluctuating opinions, energy and a creed. The future effect of the Whig propositions of '41 will not be detrimental to that party, even if in the interval they be appropriated piecemeal, as will probably be the case, by their Conservative successors. But for the moment, and in the plight in which the Whig party found themselves, it was impossible to have devised measures more conducive to their precipitate fall. Great interests were menaced by a weak government. The consequence was inevitable. Tadpole and Taper saw it in a moment. They snuffed the factious air, and felt the coming storm. Notwithstanding the extreme congeniality of these worthies, there was a little latent jealousy between them. Tadpole worshipped registration. Taper adored a cry. Tadpole always maintained that it was the winnowing of the electoral lists that could alone gain the day. Taper, on the contrary, faithful to ancient traditions, was ever of opinion that the game must ultimately be won by popular clamour. It always seemed so impossible that the Conservative party could ever be popular, the extreme graciousness and personal popularity of the leaders not being sufficiently apparent to be esteemed an adequate set-off against the inveterate odium that attached to their opinions. That the Tadpole philosophy was the favoured tenet in high places, and Taper had had his knuckles well rapped more than once for manoeuvring too actively against the new poor law, and for hiring several link boys to bawl a much wronged lady's name in the Park when the court prorogued Parliament. And now, after all, in 1841, it seemed that Taper was right. There was a great clamour in every quarter, and the clamour was against the Whigs and in favour of Conservative principles. What Canadian timber merchants meant by Conservative principles it is not difficult to conjecture, or West Indian planters. It was tolerably clear on the hustings what squires and farmers and their followers meant by Conservative principles. What they mean by Conservative principles now is another question, and whether Conservative principles mean something higher than a perpetuation of fiscal arrangements, some of them impolitic, none of them important. But no matter what different bodies of men understood by the cry in which they all joined, the cry existed: Taper beat Tadpole, and the great Conservative party beat the shattered and exhausted Whigs. Notwithstanding the abstraction of his legal studies, Coningsby could not be altogether insensible to the political crisis. In the political world of course he never mixed, but the friends of his boyhood were deeply interested in affairs, and they lost no opportunity which he would permit them of cultivating his society. Their occasional fellowship, a visit now and then to Sidonia, and a call sometimes on Flora, who lived at Richmond, comprised his social relations. His general acquaintance did not desert him, but he was out of sight, and did not wish to be remembered. Mr. Ormsby asked him to dinner, and occasionally mourned over his fate in the bow window of White's, while Lord Eskdale even went to see him in the Temple, was interested in his progress, and said with an encouraging look that when he was called to the bar, all his friends must join and get up the steam. Coningsby had once met Mr. Rigby, who was walking with the Duke of Agincourt, which was probably the reason he could not notice a lawyer. Mr. Rigby cut Coningsby. Lord Eskdale had obtained from Villebecque accurate details as to the cause of Coningsby being disinherited. Our hero, if one in such fallen fortunes may still be described as a hero, had mentioned to Lord Eskdale his sorrow that his grandfather had died in anger with him; but Lord Eskdale, without dwelling on the subject, had assured him that he had reason to believe that if Lord Monmouth had lived, affairs would have been different. He had altered the disposition of his property at a moment of great and general irritation and excitement, and had been too indolent, perhaps really too indisposed, which he was unwilling ever to acknowledge, to recur to a calmer and more equitable settlement. Lord Eskdale had been more frank with Sidonia, and had told him all about the refusal to become a candidate for Darlford against Mr. Millbank, the communication of Rigby to Lord Monmouth as to the presence of Oswald Millbank at the Castle, and the love of Coningsby for his sister. All these details, furnished by Villebecque to Lord Eskdale, had been truly transferred by that nobleman to his co-executor, and Sidonia, when he had sufficiently digested them, had made Lady Wallinger acquainted with the whole story. The dissolution of the Whig Parliament by the Whigs, the project of which had reached Lord Monmouth a year before, and yet in which nobody believed to the last moment, at length took place. All the world was dispersed in the heart of the season, and our solitary student of the Temple in his lonely chambers, notwithstanding all his efforts, found his eye rather wander over the pages of Tid and Chitty, as he remembered that the great event to which he had so looked forward was now occurring, and he, after all, was no actor in the mighty drama. It was to have been the epoch of his life, when he was to have found himself in that proud position for which all the studies and meditations and higher impulses of his nature had been preparing him. It was a keen trial of a man. Every one of his friends and old companions were candidates, and with sanguine prospects. Lord Henry was certain for a division of his county. Buckhurst harangued a large agricultural borough in his vicinity. Eustace Lyle and Vere stood in coalition for a Yorkshire town, and Oswald Millbank solicited the suffrages of an important manufacturing constituency. They sent their addresses to Coningsby. He was deeply interested as he traced in them the influence of his own mind, often recognised the very expressions to which he had habituated them. Amid the confusion of a general election, no unimpassioned critic had time to canvass the language of an address to an isolated constituency, yet an intelligent speculator on the movements of political parties might have detected in these public declarations some intimation of new views, and of a tone of political feeling that has unfortunately been too long absent from the public life of this country. It was the end of a sultry July day, the last ray of the sun shooting down Pall Mall, sweltering with dust. There was a crowd round the doors of the Carlton and the Reform Clubs, and every now and then an express arrived with the agitating bulletin of a fresh defeat or a new triumph. Coningsby was walking up Pall Mall. He was going to dine at the Oxford and Cambridge Club, the only club on whose list he had retained his name, that he might occasionally have the pleasure of meeting an Eton or Cambridge friend without the annoyance of encountering any of his former fashionable acquaintances. He lighted in his walk on Mr. Tadpole and Mr. Taper, both of whom he knew. The latter did not notice him, but Mr. Tadpole, more good-natured, bestowed on him a rough nod, not unmarked by a slight expression of coarse pity. Coningsby ordered his dinner, and then took up the evening papers, where he learnt the return of Vere and Lyle, and read a speech of Buckhurst denouncing the Venetian constitution, to the amazement of several thousand persons, apparently not a little terrified by this unknown danger now first introduced to their notice. Being true Englishmen, they were all against Buckhurst's opponent, who was of the Venetian party, and who ended by calling out Buckhurst for his personalities. Coningsby had dined and was reading in the library, when a waiter brought up a third edition of the Sun, with electioneering bulletins from the manufacturing districts to the very latest hour. Some large letters which expressed the name of Darlford caught his eye. There seemed great excitement in that borough. Strange proceedings had happened. The column was headed, "Extraordinary affair. Withdrawal of the Liberal candidate. 2 Tory candidates in the field." His eye glanced over an animated speech of Mr. Millbank. His countenance changed, his heart palpitated. Mr. Millbank had resigned the representation of the town, but not from weakness. His avocations demanded his presence. He had been requested to let his son supply his place, but his son was otherwise provided for. He should always take a deep interest in the town and trade of Darlford. He hoped that the link between the borough and Hellingsley would ever be cherished. Loud cheering. He wished in parting from them to take a step which would conciliate all parties, put an end to local heats and factious contentions, and secure the town an able and worthy representative. For these reasons he begged to propose to them a gentleman who bore a name which many of them greatly honoured. For himself, he knew the individual, and it was his firm opinion that whether they considered his talents, his character, or the ancient connection of his family with the district, he could not propose a candidate more worthy of their confidence than Harry Coningsby, Esquire. This proposition was received with that wild enthusiasm which occasionally bursts out in the most civilised communities. The contest between Millbank and Rigby was equally balanced. Neither party was overconfident. The Conservatives were not particularly zealous in behalf of their champion. There was no Marquess of Monmouth and no Coningsby Castle now to back him. He was fighting on his own resources, and he was a beaten horse. The Liberals did not like the prospect of a defeat, and dreaded the mortification of Rigby's triumph. The moderate men, who thought more of local than political circumstances, liked the name of Coningsby. Mr. Millbank had dexterously prepared his leading supporters for the substitution. Some traits of the character and conduct of Coningsby had been cleverly circulated. Thus there was a combination of many favourable causes in his favour. In half an hour's time his image was stamped on the brain of every inhabitant of the borough as an interesting and accomplished youth who had been wronged and who deserved to be rewarded. It was whispered that Rigby was his enemy. Magog Wrath and his mob offered Mr. Millbank's committee to throw Mr. Rigby into the river, or to burn down his hotel, in case he was prudent enough not to show. Mr. Rigby determined to fight to the last. All his hopes were now staked on the successful result of this contest. It were impossible, if he were returned, that his friends could refuse him high office. The whole of Lord Monmouth's reduced legacy was devoted to this end. The third edition of the Sun left Mr. Rigby in vain attempting to address an infuriated populace. Here was a revolution in the fortunes of our forlorn Coningsby. When his grandfather first sent for him to Monmouth House, his destiny was not verging on greater vicissitudes. He rose from his seat, and was surprised that all the silent gentlemen who were about him did not mark his agitation. Not an individual there that he knew. It was now an hour to midnight, and to-morrow the almost unconscious candidate was to go to the poll. In a tumult of suppressed emotion, Coningsby returned to his chambers. He found a letter in his box from Oswald Millbank, who had been twice at the Temple. Oswald had been returned without a contest, and had reached Darlford in time to hear Coningsby nominated. He set off instantly to London, and left at his friend's chambers a rapid narrative of what had happened, with information that he should call on him again on the morrow at 9 o'clock, when they were to repair together immediately to Darlford, in time for Coningsby to be chaired, for no one entertained a doubt of his triumph. Coningsby did not sleep a wink that night, and yet when he rose early felt fresh enough for any exploit, however difficult or hazardous. He felt as an Egyptian does when the Nile rises after the elevation had been despaired of. At the very lowest ebb of his fortunes, an event had occurred which seemed to restore all. He dared not contemplate the ultimate result of all these wonderful changes. Enough for him that when all seemed dark, he was about to be returned to Parliament by the father of Edith, and his vanquished rival, who was to bite the dust before him, was the author of all his misfortunes. Love, vengeance, justice, the glorious pride of having acted rightly, the triumphant sense of complete and absolute success, here were chaotic materials from which order was at length evolved, and all subsided in an overwhelming feeling of gratitude to that Providence that had so signally protected him. There was a knock at the door. It was Oswald. They embraced. It seemed that Oswald was as excited as Coningsby. His eyes sparkled. His manner was energetic. "We must talk it all over during our journey. We have not a minute to spare." During that journey, Coningsby learned something of the course of affairs which gradually had brought about so singular a revolution in his favour. We mentioned that Sidonia had acquired a thorough knowledge of the circumstances which had occasioned and attended the disinheritance of Coningsby. These he had told to Lady Wallinger, first by letter, afterwards in more detail on her arrival in London. Lady Wallinger had conferred with her husband. She was not surprised at the goodness of Coningsby, and she sympathised with all his calamities. He had ever been the favourite of her judgment, and her romance had always consisted in blending his destinies with those of her beloved Edith. Sir Joseph was a judicious man, who never cared to commit himself, a little selfish, but good, just, and honourable, with some impulses, only a little afraid of them. But then his wife stepped in like an angel, and gave them the right direction. They were both absolutely impressed with Coningsby's admirable conduct, and Lady Wallinger was determined that her husband should express to others the convictions which he acknowledged in unison with herself. Sir Joseph spoke to Mr. Millbank, who stared, but Sir Joseph spoke feebly. Lady Wallinger conveyed all this intelligence, and all her impressions, to Oswald and Edith. The younger Millbank talked to his father, who, making no admissions, listened with interest, inveighed against Lord Monmouth, and condemned his will. After some time Mr. Millbank made inquiries about Coningsby, took an interest in his career, and, like Lord Eskdale, declared that when he was called to the bar his friends would have an opportunity to evince their sincerity. Affairs remained in this state until Oswald thought that circumstances were sufficiently ripe to urge his father on the subject. The position which Oswald had assumed at Millbank had necessarily made him acquainted with the affairs and fortune of his father. When he computed the vast wealth which he knew was at his parents' command, and recalled Coningsby in his humble chambers, toiling after all his noble efforts without any results, and his sister pining in provincial solitude, Oswald began to curse wealth, and to ask himself what was the use of all their marvellous industry and supernatural skill. He addressed his father with that irresistible frankness which a strong faith can alone inspire. What are the objects of wealth, if not to bless those who possess our hearts? The only daughter, the friend to whom the only son was indebted for his life, here are two beings surely whom one would care to bless, and both are unhappy. Mr. Millbank listened without prejudice, for he was already convinced. But he felt some interest in the present conduct of Coningsby. A Coningsby working for his bread was a novel incident for him. He wished to be assured of its authenticity. He was resolved to convince himself of the fact. And perhaps he would have gone on yet for a little time, and watched the progress of the experiment, already interested and delighted by what had reached him, had not the dissolution brought affairs to a crisis. The misery of Oswald at the position of Coningsby, the silent sadness of Edith, his own conviction, which assured him that he could do nothing wiser or better than take this young man to his heart, so ordained it that Mr. Millbank, who was after all the creature of impulse, decided suddenly and decided rightly. Never making a single admission to all the representations of his son, Mr. Millbank in a moment did all that his son could have dared to desire. This is a very imperfect and crude intimation of what had occurred at Millbank and Hellingsley, yet it conveys a faint sketch of the enchanting intelligence that Oswald conveyed to Coningsby during their rapid travel. When they arrived at Birmingham, they found a messenger and a dispatch informing Coningsby that at midday at Darlford he was at the head of the poll by an overwhelming majority, and that Mr. Rigby had resigned. He was, however, requested to remain at Birmingham, as they did not wish him to enter Darlford except to be chaired, so he was to arrive there in the morning. At Birmingham, therefore, they remained. There was Oswald's election to talk of as well as Coningsby. They had hardly time for this. Now they were both members of Parliament. Men must have been at school together to enjoy the real fun of meeting thus and realising boyish dreams. Often, years ago, they had talked of these things and had assumed these results, but those were words and dreams, these were positive facts. After some doubts and struggles, in the freshness of their youth, Oswald Millbank and Harry Coningsby were members of the British Parliament, public characters, responsible agents with a career. This afternoon at Birmingham was as happy an afternoon as usually falls to the lot of man. Both of these companions were labouring under that degree of excitement which is necessary to felicity. They had enough to talk about. Edith was no longer a forbidden or a sorrowful subject. There was rapture in their again meeting under such circumstances. Then there were their friends, that dear Buckhurst, who had just been called out for styling his opponent a Venetian, and all their companions of early days. What a sudden and marvellous change in all their destinies! Life was a pantomime. The wand was waved, and it seemed that the schoolfellows had of a sudden become elements of power, springs of the great machine. A train arrived. Restless, they sallied forth to seek diversion in the dispersion of the passengers. Coningsby and Millbank, with that glance, a little inquisitive, even impertinent, if we must confess it, with which one greets a stranger when he emerges from a public conveyance, were lounging on the platform. The train arrived, stopped, the doors were thrown open, and from one of them emerged Mr. Rigby. Coningsby, who had dined, was greatly tempted to take off his hat and make him a bow, but he refrained. Their eyes met. Rigby was dead beat. He was evidently used up, a man without a resource. The sight of Coningsby, his last blow, he had met his fate. "My dear fellow," said Coningsby, "I remember I wanted you to dine with my grandfather at Montham, and that fellow would not ask you. Such is life." About 11 o'clock the next morning they arrived at the Darlford station. Here they were met by an anxious deputation, who received Coningsby as if he were a prophet, and ushered him into a car covered with satin and blue ribbons, and drawn by 6 beautiful grey horses, caparisoned in his colours, and ridden by postillions whose very whips were blue and white. Triumphant music sounded, banners waved, the multitude were marshalled, the Freemasons at the first opportunity fell into the procession, the Oddfellows joined it at the next corner. Preceded and followed by thousands, with colours flying, trumpets sounding, and endless huzzas, flags and handkerchiefs waving from every window, and every balcony filled with dames and maidens bedecked with his colours, Coningsby was borne through enthusiastic Darlford like Paulus Emilius returning from Macedon. Uncovered, still in deep mourning, his fine figure and graceful bearing, and his intelligent brow, at once won every female heart. The singularity was that all were of the same opinion. Everybody cheered him. Every house was adorned with his colours. His triumphal return was no party question. Magog Wrath and Bully Bluck walked together like lambs at the head of his procession. The car stopped before the principal hotel in the High Street. It was Mr. Millbank's committee. The broad street was so crowded that, as every one declared, you might have walked on the heads of the people. Every window was full, the very roofs were peopled. The car stopped. The populace gave 3 cheers for Mr. Millbank. Their late member, surrounded by his friends, stood in the balcony, which was fitted up with Coningsby's colours, and bore his name on the hangings in gigantic letters formed of dahlias. The flashing and inquiring eye of Coningsby caught the form of Edith, who was leaning on her father's arm. The hustings were opposite the hotel, and here, after a while, Coningsby was carried, and, stepping from his car, took up his post to address for the first time a public assembly. Anxious as the people were to hear him, it was long before their enthusiasm could subside into silence. At length that silence was deep and absolute. He spoke. His powerful and rich tones reached every ear. In 5 minutes' time every one looked at his neighbour, and without speaking they agreed that there never was anything like this heard in Darlford before. He addressed them for a considerable time, for he had a good deal to say, not only to express his gratitude for the unprecedented manner in which he had become their representative, and for the spirit in which they had greeted him, but he had to offer them no niggard exposition of the views and opinions of the member whom they had so confidingly chosen, without even a formal declaration of his sentiments. He did this with so much clearness, and in a manner so pointed and popular, that the deep attention of the multitude never wavered. His lively illustrations kept them often in continued merriment. But when, towards his close, he drew some picture of what he hoped might be the character of his future and lasting connection with the town, the vast throng was singularly affected. There were a great many present at that moment who, though they had never seen Coningsby before, would willingly have then died for him. Coningsby had touched their hearts, for he had spoken from his own. His spirit had entirely magnetised them. Darlford believed in Coningsby, and a very good creed. And now Coningsby was conducted to the opposite hotel. He walked through the crowd. The progress was slow, as every one wished to shake hands with him. His friends, however, at last safely landed him. He sprang up the stairs. He was met by Mr. Millbank, who welcomed him with the greatest warmth, and offered his hearty congratulations. "It is to you, dear sir, that I am indebted for all this," said Coningsby. "No," said Mr. Millbank, "it is to your own high principles, great talents, and good heart." After he had been presented by the late member to the principal personages in the borough, Mr. Millbank said, "I think we must now give Mr. Coningsby a little rest. Come with me," he added, "here is some one who will be very glad to see you." Speaking thus, he led our hero a little away, and placing his arm in Coningsby's with great affection, opened the door of an apartment. There was Edith, radiant with loveliness, and beaming with love. Their agitated hearts told at a glance the tumult of their joy. The father joined their hands, and blessed them with words of tenderness. Chapter VII. The marriage of Coningsby and Edith took place early in the autumn. It was solemnised at Millbank, and they passed their first moon at Hellingsley, which place was in future to be the residence of the member for Darlford. The estate was to devolve to Coningsby after the death of Mr. Millbank, who in the meantime made arrangements which permitted the newly married couple to reside at the Hall in a manner becoming its occupants. All these settlements, as Mr. Millbank assured Coningsby, were effected not only with the sanction, but at the express instance of his son. An event, however, occurred not very long after the marriage of Coningsby, which rendered this generous conduct of his father-in-law no longer necessary to his fortunes, though he never forgot its exercise. The gentle and unhappy daughter of Lord Monmouth quitted a scene with which her spirit had never greatly sympathised. Perhaps she might have lingered in life for yet a little while, had it not been for that fatal inheritance which disturbed her peace and embittered her days, haunting her heart with the recollection that she had been the unconscious instrument of injuring the only being whom she loved, and embarrassing and encumbering her with duties foreign to her experience and her nature. The marriage of Coningsby had greatly affected her, and from that day she seemed gradually to decline. She died towards the end of the autumn, and subject to an ample annuity to Villebecque, she bequeathed the whole of her fortune to the husband of Edith. Gratifying as it was to him to present such an inheritance to his wife, it was not without a pang that he received the intelligence of the death of Flora. Edith sympathised in his affectionate feelings, and they raised a monument to her memory in the gardens of Hellingsley. Coningsby passed his next Christmas in his own hall, with his beautiful and gifted wife by his side, and surrounded by the friends of his heart and his youth. They stand now on the threshold of public life. They are in the leash, but in a moment they will be slipped. What will be their fate? Will they maintain in august assemblies and high places the great truths which in study and in solitude they have embraced? Or will their courage exhaust itself in the struggle, their enthusiasm evaporate before hollow-hearted ridicule, their generous impulses yield with a vulgar catastrophe to the tawdry temptations of a low ambition? Will their skilled intelligence subside into being the adroit tool of a corrupt party? Will vanity confound their fortunes, or jealousy wither their sympathies? Or will they remain brave, single, and true, refuse to bow before shadows and worship phrases, sensible of the greatness of their position, recognise the greatness of their duties, denounce to a perplexed and disheartened world the frigid theories of a generalising age that have destroyed the individuality of man, and restore the happiness of their country by believing in their own energies and daring to be great? Chapter VIII. Recording by Nicholas Clifford, Middlebury, Vermont, USA. End of Coningsby or the New Generation by Benjamin Disraeli.